My husband threw me out into the pouring rain, emptied our joint accounts, and mocked me as a broke nobody who would never survive without him. In court a week later, his high-priced lawyer laughed in my face, right up until the moment the judge revealed who I really was, and federal agents locked the courtroom doors from the outside. My name is Maya, I am 34 years old, and my husband thought he was discarding a useless work-from-home bookkeeper. He had no idea. He was married to a senior undercover federal agent. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire criminal syndicate, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you love seeing arrogant people get exactly what they deserve. This is a story about patient strategy and the ultimate payback. The cold rain was coming down in heavy, unrelenting sheets. When I pulled my car into the wide driveway of the luxury suburban estate I shared with my husband Marcus. I had just finished a mundane grocery run, my mind occupied with the simple thought of what to cook for dinner. Instead of the warm and welcoming home I expected, I was greeted by the jarring sight of heavy black trash bags strewn carelessly across the wet concrete. My clothes, my shoes, and fragments of my personal life were sitting in muddy puddles, soaking through the cheap plastic. I stepped out of the car, the freezing rain instantly saturating my hair and seeping through my coat. I looked up at the sprawling covered porch. Marcus stood there perfectly dry and immaculate in his tailored Italian suit, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. A smug, victorious smirk played on his lips, a look of pure superiority that he reserved for those he considered beneath him. I walked slowly toward the brick steps, the wet paper grocery bags in my hands beginning to dissolve and tear in the downpour. Before I could even ask what was happening, Marcus reached into his breast pocket and pulled out my primary debit card. He held it up high, making sure he locked eyes with me, and snapped it cleanly in half. He tossed the broken plastic pieces down the steps, watching them land in a murky puddle right at my feet. "The accounts are completely drained, Maya," he said, his voice carrying easily over the rhythmic sound of the heavy rain. "Every single cent is gone. I have already filed the paperwork. You are going to sign the divorce settlement, leaving you with nothing, or you can sleep on the street tonight. You are a leech, and I am entirely done carrying your dead weight." I stood frozen on the driveway, water dripping down my face and neck, letting his cruel words hang in the heavy, damp air. For 4 years I had meticulously played the role of the quiet, unassuming wife, enduring his relentless condescension to maintain my deep cover. But this display of absolute malice was startling even for a documented narcissist like Marcus. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy oak front door swung open much wider. Out stepped Chloe, my white sister-in-law, who was married to Marcus's older brother David. She was casually holding my favorite vintage Hermes handbag, examining the pristine leather with a deeply entitled gleam in her pale eyes. Chloe had spent the last 4 years masking her intense racism behind passive-aggressive comments about my natural hair, my modest background, and my so-called boring work, while Marcus always stood by and silently condoned her behavior. He would tell me I was overreacting whenever I pointed out her blatant prejudice, gaslighting me into silence. She looked down at me from the elevated porch, wrinkling her nose in disgust as if I were a piece of garbage that had unfortunately washed up on their pristine, manicured lawn. "Take your little bookkeeping ledgers with you, Maya," she sneered, tossing a damp spiral notebook past Marcus and onto the wet grass below. "I am sure the housing projects need someone to count food stamps. You never truly belonged in this wealthy family anyway." Marcus chuckled darkly, pulling Chloe into a brief, affectionate side hug that made my stomach turn. But the humiliation was not over yet. Stepping out from the warm shadows of the grand hallway was Jessica, Marcus's 24-year-old executive assistant. She walked confidently up to my husband and wrapped her arms tightly around his waist, resting her manicured hand protectively over her slightly rounded stomach. Marcus kissed her temple gently, then looked back down at me with eyes devoid of any human empathy. "Jessica is carrying my actual heir," he announced proudly, his voice booming with arrogant authority. "A child who will grow up knowing the true value of our financial legacy. You are just a broke freelance accountant who works from a cheap laptop in the guest room. You have zero leverage in this situation. You have absolutely no money to hire a competent lawyer. Do not even think about trying to fight me in family court, because I promise you will lose everything you have left. I will crush you until you have no identity left in this city." The sheer audacity of the theatrical scene playing out before me was almost unbelievable. They had intentionally gathered together to witness my absolute humiliation, treating my sudden forced homelessness as a twisted spectator sport. They fully expected me to break down in tears. They expected me to fall to my wet knees and beg for a cheap hotel room or a tiny sliver of the savings I had supposedly helped them build. They desperately wanted to completely break a black woman who had dared to enter their exclusive, ultra-wealthy world. But I did not shed a single tear. I simply dropped the ruined, soggy grocery bags onto the wet driveway, letting the contents spill out into the rain. I reached down calmly, picked up my soaked notebook, and looked directly at Marcus, Chloe, and Jessica. I did not scream, cry, or argue. I just gave them a slow, cold smile that caused Marcus's arrogant smirk to falter for just a fraction of a second. I turned on my heel and walked away, my boots splashing heavily through the puddles as I left the massive house and the toxic neighborhood behind. Once I was 3 blocks away and completely out of their line of sight, I slipped my cold hand into the hidden waterproof lining of my jacket. I pulled out a heavy encrypted satellite phone that Marcus never knew existed. The bright screen illuminated the dark, rainy street with a blinking green notification. Target number 4. Marcus offshore wire transfer complete. The federal web is set. I wiped the raindrops from the glowing screen and whispered quietly into the stormy night. Enjoy the luxury house while you still can, Marcus, because your time is officially up. The neon light of the Starlight Motel flickered through the thin, stained curtains of room number 4. It was exactly 2 in the morning. I was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress, my damp hair tied back, staring at the glowing screen of my encrypted federal laptop. The stark contrast between this damp, nicotine-stained room and the sprawling 6-bedroom estate I had been thrown out of just hours ago was laughable. But I was not mourning the loss of high-thread count sheets or marble floors. I was meticulously tracking a web of offshore shell companies. A sudden violent pounding on the flimsy wooden door shattered the quiet of the night. The heavy blows rattled the cheap chain lock. I calmly closed my laptop, slid it under the lumpy mattress, and walked toward the door. I did not ask who it was. I already knew Marcus would not wait for morning to execute his next move. I pulled the door open just a fraction. Standing under the flickering yellow porch light was Sterling Marcus's aggressively expensive divorce attorney. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than the entire motel we were standing in, and he looked thoroughly disgusted by his surroundings. Without a single word of greeting, Sterling shoved a thick, heavy stack of legal documents right into my chest, forcing me to take them, or let them drop into the muck. "Sign the papers," Maya Sterling demanded, his voice dripping with unfiltered contempt. He glanced around the desolate parking lot, making no effort to hide his disdain. "Marcus is offering you a clean break. You take the clothes on your back and you walk away. No alimony, no claim to the house, no share of the business assets. If you sign right now, we will not pursue you for the legal fees of drafting this absolute garbage." I looked down at the documents. Even in the dim light, my trained forensic accountant eyes instantly caught the predatory clauses buried in the fine print. They were attempting to force me to assume liability for a specific set of dummy corporations. It was a classic trap. I looked back up at Sterling, my expression completely flat. "I am not signing a fraudulent settlement that leaves me holding Marcus's illegal liabilities," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. "Tell my husband he needs to try a lot harder than this." Sterling let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He leaned closer, his face turning red with sudden anger. He clearly was not used to being challenged by someone standing in a $20 a night motel room. "Listen to me very carefully," Sterling sneered, his tone turning viciously racist and classist. "You need to drop this fake confidence. Sign it. A penniless black woman without a lawyer isn't going to win in state court. You have absolutely zero leverage here. You do not have the money to fight us. You do not have the connections to fight us. And the judge who handles these cases plays golf with Marcus every Sunday. You are entirely out of your league. Sign the paper and save yourself the embarrassment of being crushed in public." I simply handed the heavy stack of papers back to him. I said no. Sterling snatched the papers, his jaw tight with fury. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers jabbing aggressively at the bright screen. You want to play hardball? Fine. Let us see how tough you are when reality hits you. He dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. The dial tone echoed in the damp air before Marcus answered on the second ring. His voice was thick with arrogance, clearly enjoying the fact that he was tormenting me in the middle of the night. Is it done? Marcus asked. Did the leech sign the papers? She is being difficult, Marcus Sterling replied, glaring intensely at me. She thinks she can negotiate a better deal. A loud, cruel laugh erupted from the phone speaker. Marcus sounded like he was pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon. Maya. Maya, Marcus crooned through the device. I warned you not to test me. I knew you would try to be stubborn. You always did have a completely misplaced sense of pride. Since you want to play games, I decided to make a little phone call of my own about an hour ago. A cold chill ran down my spine, but I kept my face entirely impassive. What did you do, Marcus? I was just reviewing our expenses. Marcus continued, his tone turning deadly and precise. And I realized I have been wasting thousands of dollars a month paying for your mother's premium health insurance plan. You know, the comprehensive policy that covers her vital heart medications, the ones she literally needs to stay alive. Well, since you are no longer my problem, neither is she. I canceled her policy effective immediately. Sterling smiled a nasty, triumphant smile, waiting for me to break down. He expected me to cry, to beg, to drop to my knees and plead for my mother's life. Marcus knew exactly how expensive those medications were. He knew my mother's pension could never cover them. He was using my mother's health as a weapon to force me into signing away my rights to his massive fortune. It was the ultimate escalation. For years, I had watched Marcus throw hundreds of thousands of dollars at his brother David to cover up his gross mismanagement of fake charities. I had watched him buy his racist sister-in-law Chloe luxury cars just to keep her happy. But the moment it came to my family, to the woman who gave me life, he viewed spending a single dime as a burden. Now he was weaponizing her survival. So here is your new reality, Maya, Marcus sneered through the phone. You are going to sign those papers right now, or your mother is going to miss her next treatment. I will make sure she cannot even get a basic refill at the local pharmacy. You have exactly 10 seconds to decide if your pride is worth your mother's life. The silence in the motel doorway was heavy. Sterling held the pen out to me, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I looked at the pen, then at the phone in Sterling's hand. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I just stepped forward, grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden door, and looked directly into Sterling's surprised eyes. Tell my husband he just made the biggest mistake of his miserable life, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. I slammed the door forcefully, the loud crack echoing through the empty parking lot. I immediately threw the deadbolt and the chain lock, shutting out Sterling's muffled, angry shouts from the other side. I could hear him kicking the door once before his footsteps stomped away toward his luxury sedan. I did not waste a single second. I walked straight to the bed, lifted the mattress, and pulled out my federal laptop. I flipped it open, my fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard. The screen illuminated the dark room with lines of complex code and secure government login portals. I bypassed the standard security protocols, entering my credentials to access the highest clearance level of the Federal Criminal Investigation Network. Marcus thought he held all the power because he controlled a few health insurance premiums. He truly believed I was just a helpless, broke woman who would fold under the pressure of his financial abuse. He had no idea he had just handed a senior federal agent the perfect motivation to accelerate an ongoing federal takedown. I navigated through the encrypted database, bypassing international banking firewalls with the specific authorization codes granted to my task force. I targeted the exact offshore accounts Marcus had spent years hiding from the government. I locked onto his primary shell company. I highlighted the massive account balance he used to fund his lavish lifestyle and his criminal enterprises. My finger hovered over the execution key. You want to freeze my mother's medicine, I whispered to the glowing screen, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. Let's see how you feel when I freeze your $40 million Cayman Island trust. I hit the enter key. The system accepted the federal seizure command instantly. The funds were locked. The trap was sprung. The war had officially begun. I did not waste a single second celebrating my digital victory in that dingy motel room. Marcus thought he held the ultimate trump card. He genuinely believed that cutting off my mother's medical insurance would reduce me to a weeping compliant victim, willing to sign away my entire life for a few prescription refills. He had no idea he had just handed a highly trained federal investigator the perfect excuse to expedite a massive financial seizure. I had tracked the background noise from his end of the line during our brief hostile phone call. The faint, distinctive clinking of crystal glasses and the unmistakable live jazz quartet playing in the background meant he was at El Ora, the city's most exclusive reservation-only Michelin star restaurant. It was his absolute favorite place to flaunt his dirty wealth, a place where a single appetizer cost more than what he claimed I made in a month. I left the motel immediately, not bothering to change out of my damp clothes. My boots were still heavily scuffed, my hair still slicked back from the freezing rain, and my jacket hung heavy with moisture. I wanted them to see me exactly as they had left me. I wanted their false sense of absolute superiority to be at its peak before I systematically dismantled it. The maitre d' at El Ora stepped forward with a polished, highly condescending smile as I pushed through the heavy gilded doors. He opened his mouth to inform me of the strict dress code, but I flashed a brief commanding look that I had perfected over years of undercover federal fieldwork. I walked right past his outstretched arm, my wet boots squeaking softly against the imported Italian marble floor. Heads turned as I navigated the opulent dining room. Wealthy patrons in silk dresses and tailored tuxedos paused their hushed conversations, their eyes tracking the soaking wet black woman striding purposefully through their pristine sanctuary. I spotted them immediately in the VIP section, occupying the large velvet booth elevated above the rest of the dining floor. Marcus was holding court, a glass of vintage champagne in his hand, laughing loudly. Jessica sat glued to his side, practically draped over his arm. Across from them sat David Marcus's older brother and the cowardly figurehead of their fake charitable foundations, alongside his wife Chloe. They were toasting to my newly homeless status. I walked straight up to their table and stood perfectly still. The laughter died instantly. Chloe was the first to react. She practically dropped her oyster fork, her pale face contorting into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. She looked me up and down, taking in my damp jacket and the rainwater dripping from my hair onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Marcus, are you kidding me right now?" Chloe shrieked, her voice shrill enough to make the neighboring tables flinch. She frantically waved her hand in the air, snapping her fingers toward a passing waiter. "Security, we need security over here immediately. There is a vagrant polluting our table." She turned her furious glare back to me, her racist microaggressions spilling out, just as they had for the past 4 years. "We are trying to enjoy a 5-star meal, Maya. This is not a soup kitchen. You cannot just drag your ghetto drama into a place like this and expect us to feed you. I always told Marcus you would end up exactly where you belong, begging for scraps." Marcus leaned back against the velvet booth, swirling the champagne in his glass. He looked immensely pleased with himself, basking in the cruel scene his sister-in-law was causing. He genuinely believed my presence here was an act of total desperation. He thought the motel eviction and the threat to my mother had successfully broken my spirit, forcing me to crawl back to him in public. "You are embarrassing yourself." Maya Marcus sighed, putting on a fake voice of pity for the watching crowd. "I told you it was over. You chose to be stubborn, and now look at you. Dripping wet and disturbing paying customers." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather money clip. With slow, deliberate arrogance, he extracted a crisp $100 bill. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he flicked his wrist, letting the bill flutter down until it landed on the floor right beside my wet boots. "Buy yourself a hot meal and get lost," Marcus commanded, his tone dripping with absolute authority. "Take a cab back to whatever slum you crawled out of. We are celebrating our new future, and you are no longer a part of it." Jessica giggled softly, leaning her head on Marcus's shoulder while Chloe crossed her arms, looking triumphant. They waited for me to break to yell or to scramble for the cash on the floor. I did not say a word to Marcus. I simply lifted my damp boot and stepped squarely onto the crisp $100 bill, pinning it to the marble floor. The entire table went dead silent. Marcus's smug smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. I ignored him completely. I ignored Chloe's gasps and Jessica's wide eyes. Instead, I shifted my gaze directly to David. David had been quiet this whole time. He was the weak link, the nervous older brother who blindly signed the paperwork Marcus put in front of him. He was currently taking a long, anxious sip of his expensive red wine. I leaned forward, both of my hands flat on the edge of their table. I leaned in close, bringing my face just inches away from David's sweating forehead. I just wanted to drop by and offer my personal congratulations, David, I said, keeping my voice low, cheerful, and terrifyingly precise. That was a truly brilliant maneuver you pulled this morning with the Global Relief Fund. Processing a $4.2 million charitable disbursement through the Cayman Island accounts and routing it directly into a shell corporation in the Bahamas takes real nerve. David froze. His eyes bulged in pure terror. He inhaled sharply, sucking the red wine straight into his windpipe. He began choking violently, coughing and gasping for air as his face turned a dangerous shade of purple. Chloe started screaming, pounding on her husband's back, while Marcus shot up from his seat, staring at me with sudden, unmasked horror. How could a broke freelance bookkeeper possibly know the exact dollar amount and routing destination of his most highly classified offshore money laundering operation? I stood back up, smoothing out the lapels of my damp jacket. I gave them one final radiant smile as David continued to hack and wheeze into his napkin. "Enjoy the rest of your celebration," I said smoothly. I turned on my heel and began walking away. Just as I took my first confident step toward the exit, I saw the restaurant's general manager rushing toward their booth, flanked by two anxious-looking waiters. He was not coming to kick me out. He was holding a sleek black leather checkbook, and he looked incredibly pale, staring directly at Marcus with a message that was about to ruin their entire night. As I pushed through the gilded doors of El Ora and stepped back out into the freezing rain, a profound sense of peace settled over me. I did not need to turn around to see the absolute devastation unfolding at the VIP booth. My federal authorization had triggered a localized financial blackout, and the shockwave was hitting Marcus right on schedule. Back inside the softly lit dining room, the general manager stood rigidly beside the velvet booth. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the black leather checkbook. Marcus wiped a stray drop of spilled champagne from his tailored lapel, fully expecting the manager to apologize for my presence. Instead, the manager leaned down and spoke in a tight, nervous whisper. "Sir, I am incredibly sorry to disturb your evening," the manager said, holding out a sleek titanium credit card. "But your bank has rejected the transaction." Marcus scoffed, snatching the heavy metal card from the manager. "Do you know who I am?" "Run it again. Your machine is clearly broken. That is an exclusive Centurion card with no limit. I could buy this entire building with a single phone call." "I did run it again, sir," the manager replied, his professional customer service mask slipping to reveal genuine discomfort. "I ran it 3 times. The terminal is functioning perfectly." The bank returned a specific error code. "It says the assets have been frozen by federal authority." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Jessica gasped softly, pulling her hand away from Marcus. Chloe stopped glaring at the restaurant entrance and whipped her head around to stare at her brother-in-law. "Federal authority." Marcus barked, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and outrage. "That is ridiculous. It is a security flag. The fraud department probably locked the card because I am spending so much money. Give me the machine. I will use another account." Marcus ripped his designer wallet open. He pulled out a platinum credit card tied directly to his domestic wealth management firm and slapped it onto the marble table. The manager produced a handheld terminal and inserted the chip. The machine beeped a harsh, flat tone. "Declined." Marcus gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles popping. He pulled out a corporate offshore card. He shoved it into the machine himself. Another harsh beep echoed over the quiet jazz music playing in the background. "Declined." He tried a fourth card, a personal account he kept entirely separate from his business dealings. "Declined." The commotion was no longer a private affair. At El Ora, discretion was everything, but a wealthy patron furiously jamming multiple credit cards into a declining machine was impossible to ignore. The neighboring tables occupied by the city elite had stopped eating. Women in designer gowns and men in expensive suits were pointing discreetly, whispering behind their cloth napkins. Chloe felt the collective gaze of her wealthy peers burning into her skin. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being perceived as untouchable, wealthy, and superior. Now she was sitting at a table that could not even pay for their appetizers. "Marcus, fix this right now!" Chloe hissed, her face turning a blotchy red. "Everyone is staring at us like we are common street trash. Call your banker. Call whoever you need to call. I will not sit here and be humiliated because you forgot to pay your credit card bill." "Shut up, Chloe!" Marcus snapped frantically, tapping the screen of his smartphone to open his banking app. The screen loaded, but instead of displaying his massive balances, a gray screen popped up with a stark red warning message directing him to contact a federal hotline. Across the table, David was no longer choking on his wine, but he was barely breathing. His face was completely drained of color, his skin slick with a cold sweat. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. David was not looking at the declined credit cards. He was staring at the empty space where I had just been standing. Marcus David wheezed, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The charity. She knew about the charity. She knew the exact figure. 4.2 million. She knew it went to the Bahamas. "Calm down," Marcus growled furiously, refreshing his banking app to no avail. "She was just snooping around my home office. She probably saw a stray document and threw out a random number to scare you. She is a low-level freelance accountant. She does not know anything real." "You do not understand." David panicked, his voice rising in pitch. He grabbed Marcus by the sleeve of his suit jacket. "She said she was congratulating me on the disbursement." "Marcus, the bank says federal authority. The feds. They know. The feds are freezing the money. We are going to prison. I cannot go to federal prison." "Stop acting like a coward!" Marcus shoved his brother's hand away, completely blinded by his own towering narcissism. "There are no feds. It is a banking glitch. Maya is just a broke, desperate woman who got lucky with a guess. She does not have the power to freeze a checking account, let alone a global trust fund. I am the one with the power. I control the narrative." "Sir," the manager interrupted, his voice dropping all pretense of deference. "The bill for this evening is $3,400. Since none of your cards are functioning, I must ask for an alternative form of payment immediately, or I will be forced to contact local law enforcement." Marcus looked at the manager, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated fury. He was a man used to buying his way out of any inconvenience, a man who believed the rules did not apply to him. Being threatened with the police over a restaurant bill was an insult he could barely process. He patted his pockets, realizing he had no cash on him. He turned to David, but his brother was still hyperventilating, completely paralyzed by the looming threat of a federal indictment. "Fine," Marcus spat. He unclasped the heavy solid gold Rolex Daytona from his wrist. He slammed the $40,000 timepiece onto the marble table right next to the declined credit cards. The heavy metal clattered loudly. "Keep it in the safe as collateral," Marcus ordered, his voice shaking with rage. "I will have my assistant wire the funds first thing in the morning when the banks open and resolve this stupid glitch. If there is a single scratch on that watch when I get it back, I will buy this restaurant and fire you myself." Marcus stood up violently, throwing his cloth napkin onto his uneaten steak. He grabbed Jessica by the arm, yanking her up from the velvet booth. He stormed toward the exit, leaving David and Chloe to scramble after him in absolute disgrace. As Marcus pushed through the doors into the rainy night, his mind was entirely consumed with punishing me for showing up and ruining his celebration. I was planning how to ruin my reputation, how to make sure I never found work again, how to crush me in family court. His arrogance was so absolute, so deeply ingrained in his bones, that he was completely oblivious to the real danger. He had no idea the banking glitch was a localized execution of a federal seizure warrant, and he was walking straight into a trap that would lock him away for the rest of his life. The morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds from the previous night, casting a sharp, unforgiving light on the city streets. I was walking down a quiet, tree-lined avenue just a few blocks from the federal field office. I held a steaming cup of dark roast coffee in one hand, feeling the satisfying hum of a perfectly executed operation settling into my bones. The financial trap had been successfully sprung, and Marcus was officially bleeding out assets by the hour. I was mentally preparing my briefing for the task force when the obnoxious, aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the morning calm. A gleaming brand-new cherry-red Porsche Cayenne swerved abruptly toward the curb, tires screeching as it blocked the crosswalk directly in my path. The tinted passenger window slid down with a smooth electronic hum. Sitting behind the steering wheel, wearing an oversized pair of designer sunglasses and an unbearably smug expression, was Jessica. She leaned across the pristine leather interior, resting her manicured elbow on the passenger door frame. The enormous diamond Marcus had purchased with laundered funds sparkled aggressively on her finger. She looked me up and down, taking in my plain trench coat and practical walking shoes, completely unaware that my unassuming wardrobe was a calculated cover. "Good morning, Maya," Jessica chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and deep-seated malice. "I saw you walking from a mile away. I figured you might need a ride, seeing as Marcus reported your old sedan stolen to the police this morning. It must be so exhausting having to use public transportation like a commoner." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling absolutely no surprise at Marcus's petty retaliatory tactics. He was entirely predictable. I looked at Jessica, a 24-year-old assistant, who truly believed she had just won the ultimate prize. "I prefer the fresh air," I said, keeping my voice completely neutral. "It keeps my head clear. You should try it sometime, Jessica. It might help you see exactly what kind of man you are actually dealing with." Jessica let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She pulled off her sunglasses, revealing eyes filled with toxic triumph. "I know exactly what kind of man Marcus is," she sneered, leaning closer to the window. "He is a provider, he is a protector, and most importantly, he is a man who knows how to treat the mother of his actual child." She patted her flat stomach with a theatrical flourish, making sure I saw the gesture. The pregnancy was her ultimate weapon, the final trump card she believed would permanently secure her place in high society and completely erase my existence. "We are having a boy," Jessica announced, her voice rising so a passing pedestrian could hear. "A real heir to the empire." Marcus was so thrilled when I told him the news that he decided to completely restructure his portfolio to ensure our family is protected from gold-digging ex-wives who try to take what they did not earn. I maintained steady eye contact, betraying absolutely zero emotion. "Protected how exactly?" I asked, feeding her ego to extract the exact confirmation I needed for the federal indictment. Jessica smiled, a predatory grin that showcased her complete ignorance of the financial underworld she had just willingly plunged into. "He transferred the primary holding company entirely into my name this morning," she bragged, leaning back into the luxurious driver's seat. "The lawyer brought the paperwork to our penthouse at breakfast. I spent an hour signing dozens of asset transfer documents. The offshore accounts, the real estate trusts, the charitable foundation boards. I own the controlling stake in all of it now. Marcus said it was the best way to legally shield the assets from your greedy little hands during the divorce settlement." The sheer, breathtaking stupidity of her confession hung in the crisp morning air. Marcus had not transferred those assets out of love or a desire to protect his new family. The moment his credit cards had declined at the restaurant last night, his survival instincts had kicked in. He knew someone was looking into his finances, and like the ultimate coward he was, he had immediately searched for a naive, desperate scapegoat to take the fall. He had legally transferred ownership of a massive, heavily monitored money laundering syndicate directly to his pregnant mistress. "You signed the documents," I repeated, ensuring I captured her exact phrasing on the concealed recording device stitched into my lapel. "You put your signature on the transfer deeds for the Caribbean charitable foundations and the primary holding company." Every single page, Jessica gloated, misinterpreting my clarification for shock. "I am the sole owner on paper. You cannot touch a dime of his money, Maya, because it is legally mine now. You are just a low-level bookkeeper who got lucky for a few years. Now you are back exactly where you belong, nowhere." I looked at Jessica, stripping away the undercover persona I had worn for 4 years. The quiet, compliant wife vanished. I looked at her with the cold, calculating pity of a federal agent examining a condemned criminal. I reached into the deep pocket of my trench coat and pulled out a small, heavy stock business card. I wrote a quick sequence of numbers on the back with a black pen. I stepped forward and dropped the card directly onto her lap through the open window. Jessica looked down at the card, her smug smile faltering as she read the numbers. "What is this?" she asked, her voice losing its confident edge. "That is a federal prison identification prefix," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying icy calm. "Specifically, it is the prefix for the Minimum Security Women's Correctional Facility upstate. I highly recommend you memorize it." Jessica stared at me, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel tight enough to turn her knuckles white. "What are you talking about? You are crazy." I leaned down, placing my hands on the edge of her open window, trapping her in my gaze. "Orange washes you out, Jessica," I whispered, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "You think Marcus gave you an empire. He did not. He gave you his federal indictments. You just signed confessed ownership of a highly illegal criminal shell company used for international money laundering. You did not secure your future. You just volunteered to serve his 20-year prison sentence." The color drained completely from Jessica's face. The arrogant mistress vanished, replaced by a terrified young woman who suddenly realized she was standing in the middle of a minefield blindfolded. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "I suggest you call a very good defense attorney," I added, stepping back from the car. "And do not use the company accounts to pay the retainer. Those funds were officially seized by the Department of Justice an hour ago." Jessica let out a panicked, breathless gasp. She slammed her hand down on the window control. The glass rolled up rapidly, cutting off the cold morning air. She slammed the heavy vehicle into drive, her foot hitting the accelerator with terrified force. The Porsche peeled away from the curb, leaving a trail of black rubber marks on the pavement as she sped off into the city traffic, completely shaken and running out of time. By 2 o'clock, I walked into Marcus's legal headquarters for our divorce deposition. I strode through the mahogany doors wearing a charcoal blazer and my best poker face. Sterling was already sitting at the massive granite table flanked by Marcus. What caught my attention was Chloe. She perched on a leather sofa, smartphone raised, high camera lens pointed at the entrance. The recording light blinked red. "Look who finally showed up," Chloe narrated to her screen. "My broke sister-in-law attempting to squeeze pennies from my brother-in-law. Let us see if she screams." She was trying to bait me. For years, Chloe provoked me at family dinners, hoping I would raise my voice so she could label me the angry black woman. She wanted a viral video for her suburban social media circle to prove Marcus was the wealthy victim and I was the unhinged mistake. I ignored her phone, pulling a sleek silver pen from my pocket and taking my seat across from my soon-to-be ex-husband. "Put the phone away," Chloe, Marcus ordered, though he did not look angry. He wanted this documented too. He turned his arrogant gaze to me. "We will make this quick, Maya. I have a business to run and you are wasting my time." Sterling slid a bound stack of financial disclosures across the granite. He tapped a manicured finger against the top page. "My client is a generous man." Maya, Sterling began, his voice dripping condescension. "He wants total transparency before the final hearing tomorrow. These are certified financial records for all his domestic accounts and holdings over the last 48 hours. I pulled the documents toward me. I did not need to read past the summary page to see the blatant fraud. They completely scrubbed Marcus's portfolio. The asset management firm, the luxury properties, and millions in cash were wiped from the ledgers. The balance sheet instead showed a catastrophic negative net worth. They front-loaded the documents with fabricated corporate liabilities, massive pending lawsuits, and defaulting loans. "According to these records," Marcus, I said, keeping my tone conversational, "you are currently $5 million in debt." Marcus sighed heavily, leaning back in his leather chair. "It is a tragedy," he lied smoothly. "The market shifted. Bad investments tanked my primary holdings. The business is underwater. I am completely bankrupt, Maya. If you think you are dragging out this divorce to get half my assets, you are mistaken. Half my assets right now is a $2.5 million bill." Chloe giggled from the corner, zooming in on me. "She is realizing she cannot steal from a dry well," Chloe narrated into her phone. "The gold digger is out of luck." Sterling tapped the signature line on the final page. "This document legally acknowledges my client's insolvent financial state." By signing it, you confirm you reviewed his debts and agree to walk away with zero financial claims. If you refuse, we petition the court to split the $5 million debt evenly between you two. Sign the paper, Maya. Walk away clean. It was the ultimate trap. They tried to force me to validate his fake bankruptcy. Marcus thought he was a genius. He believed signing this acknowledgement created a bulletproof shield against future claims once he miraculously recovered his hidden offshore wealth. He was asking me to endorse his tax evasion scheme on the official record. I looked at Marcus. He was smiling that same victorious smile he wore when he threw my clothes into the rain. He felt completely untouchable, protected by his expensive lawyer, his sister-in-law, recording my supposed defeat and his fabricated financial ruin. Are you certain these documents represent your entire financial truth, Marcus? I asked, holding his gaze. Every single penny, he lied without a flinch. I am ruined. Now sign the paper and get out of my sight. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice for Chloe's camera. I gave Marcus a radiant smile that caused a brief flicker of confusion to cross his smug face. I clicked my silver pen, pressed the tip to the signature line, and signed my name with a smooth flourish. I pushed the heavy stack of papers back across the granite table towards Sterling. Thank you for the transparency, Marcus, I said, standing up. I appreciate you putting your financial status on the official legal record. It makes tomorrow extremely interesting. Marcus scoffed, shaking his head. Tomorrow is a formality. You have nothing left to fight for. I turned and walked toward the mahogany doors. Chloe lowered her phone, looking disappointed that I had not given her the dramatic reaction she desperately craved. I stepped out of the conference room, leaving them to bask in their fake victory. Back at the table, Sterling pulled the signed documents toward his open briefcase. As he reached to organize the pages, his hand brushed against the sleek silver pen I had intentionally left sitting on the polished stone. He picked it up to toss it into his bag, but something caught his eye. The heavy metal felt different than a standard office pen. Sterling rolled the silver barrel between his fingers, squinting at the intricate engraving near the clip. The color drained from Sterling's face in an instant. His heart rate spiked, pounding violently against his ribs as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He stared at the engraving, his breath hitching in his throat. It was not a luxury brand logo. It was a federal government seal. The crisp, undeniable emblem of the Department of Justice, flanked by the bold letters of the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. Sterling dropped the pen onto the granite table as if it were burning hot. He looked frantically at the bankruptcy document Maya had just signed, realizing with horrifying clarity that he had just officially submitted a fabricated financial disclosure directly to a federal agent. While Sterling was hyperventilating over a silver pen in a downtown conference room, Chloe was completely oblivious to the impending collapse of her carefully curated world. She was sitting on a plush velvet sofa inside the most exclusive designer boutique in the city, sipping a glass of complimentary champagne. A nervous sales associate stood before her, wearing white cotton gloves, to present a limited edition crocodile skin handbag. The price tag was a staggering $15,000. For Chloe, spending this kind of money on a random Tuesday afternoon was just another way to validate her superiority. She had built her entire identity around Marcus and David's laundered wealth, treating their criminal syndicate like her personal piggy bank. "I will take it," Chloe announced haughtily, waving her hand to dismiss the associate. "And bring me the matching wallet. I need some retail therapy after dealing with my brother-in-law's dramatic ex-wife this morning." She carelessly tossed her heavy black titanium credit card onto the glass display case. The sales associate scooped it up and hurried over to the register. Chloe took another sip of champagne, already planning the social media post she would create to show off her new purchase. She imagined Maya sitting in that cheap motel room crying over her empty bank accounts, while Chloe continued to live like royalty. The fantasy was abruptly shattered by the sound of a harsh electronic beep from the register. The sales associate frowned, typing rapidly on the keyboard. A moment later, the machine emitted the same sharp, rejecting tone. The young woman walked back over to the velvet sofa, her expression tense with professional discomfort. "I am so sorry, ma'am," the associate said, keeping her voice low. "Your card has been declined. Would you like to try a different method of payment?" Chloe slammed her champagne flute down on the table, the liquid splashing over the rim. Declined, she scoffed loudly, her face flushing with instant indignation. Do you have any idea how much money is in that account? Your machine is obviously broken. Run it again. I have run it 3 times, ma'am, the associate replied, stepping back slightly to avoid Chloe's wrath. The terminal is giving a hard rejection code. Furious and embarrassed, Chloe snatched her designer purse and dug through it. She pulled out a platinum card tied directly to the charitable foundation. David ran the same foundation they used to wash Marcus's dirty money. She shoved it into the associate's hand. Use this one, Chloe snapped. And I want a discount for the public humiliation you are putting me through right now. The associate hurried back to the register. A heavy silence fell over the boutique as the few other wealthy patrons turned to watch the spectacle. Then the machine beeped again. Another hard decline. Chloe snatched her handbag and stormed over to the register herself. What is wrong with your system? She demanded, leaning heavily over the glass counter. There is nothing wrong with our system, the associate replied, her professional courtesy wearing incredibly thin. The bank has placed a total lock on your accounts. Both cards are showing an immediate freeze. I cannot process this transaction. Chloe ripped the cards from the counter and stormed out of the boutique, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. She was shaking with unadulterated rage. She pulled out her phone and dialed her husband. David answered on the first ring, and the sound of his voice made Chloe stop dead in her tracks. He was not just crying. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. David, what is going on? Chloe yelled into the receiver, oblivious to the pedestrians walking past her on the crowded sidewalk. My cards were just declined at the boutique. Call the bank and tell them to fix this immediately. I look like an absolute joke in there. There is no bank to call. Chloe, David, wheezed, his voice cracking with absolute terror. It is all gone. Every single cent is gone. What do you mean gone? Chloe demanded. Stop crying and speak clearly. The accounts are zeroed out. David sobbed into the phone. I tried to log into the charity portal to transfer funds, but the interface locked me out entirely. I called the offshore manager in the Cayman Islands. The money vanished an hour ago. The domestic accounts are frozen. The credit line on our mansion is shut down tight. Even the emergency cash reserves in the holding company are completely wiped out. We have nothing, Chloe. We are completely bankrupt. Chloe's mind raced, completely rejecting the reality of the situation. Her toxic, prejudiced worldview immediately sought a familiar scapegoat. She refused to believe a legitimate federal authority was actively dismantling their empire. In her deeply racist mind, there was only one person petty enough and motivated enough to attack them today. It is Maya. Chloe hissed, her face contorting with racial animosity and pure rage. She did this. Maya, David stammered in confusion. Maya is a broke bookkeeper. She cannot wipe out international trusts. She hired someone, Chloe shrieked into the phone, drawing stares from people on the street. She probably found some ghetto hacker from her old neighborhood to breach our accounts out of revenge. She is throwing a tantrum because Marcus finally kicked her out and cut off her mother's insurance. She thinks she can steal our money to get back at us. I am going to end her. Chloe ended the call before David could say another word. She opened a hidden tracking application on her smartphone. Months ago, Marcus had secretly installed a location tracker on Maya's phone to monitor her movements, and Chloe had demanded the login credentials just so she could spy on her sister-in-law. The map loaded quickly on her screen, a blinking red dot showing Maya's exact location at a nearby upscale coffee shop. Chloe gripped her phone tightly, her vision tunneling with fury. She genuinely believed she was the victim of a jealous, vindictive ex-wife. She thought she could just march up to Maya, demand her stolen money back, and threaten her with the police. Her overwhelming arrogance made her completely blind to the sheer scale of the trap closing tightly around her. I am going to make you pay for this, you thief, Chloe muttered to herself, her voice shaking with adrenaline. She shoved her phone into her purse and stormed down the sidewalk, her posture rigid with aggressive force. She was completely focused on destroying Maya. She was so consumed by her own blinding entitlement that she did not check her surroundings at all. She did not notice the sleek black armored SUV with heavily tinted windows that smoothly pulled away from the curb across the street. As Chloe marched toward the coffee shop to confront a woman she thought was a helpless target, the federal vehicle rolled silently behind her, tailing her every single move. The bell above the heavy glass door of the upscale coffee shop chimed sharply. I did not need to look up from my encrypted tablet to know exactly who had just crossed the threshold. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, keeping my eyes fixed on the digital financial ledgers scrolling across my screen. The aggressive rhythmic clicking of designer heels marching across the hardwood floor announced Chloe before she even opened her mouth. I had been sitting at a corner table for 20 minutes, perfectly positioned with a clear view of the entrance and the exits. I was fully aware that the tracker Marcus had placed on my phone was leading her right to me. I wanted her to find me. Chloe stormed through the quiet cafe like a hurricane of white privilege and toxic entitlement. The low murmur of morning conversations died instantly, as patrons turned to stare at the frantic woman waving her smartphone like a weapon. Her usually pristine blonde hair was slightly disheveled from the wind, and her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She spotted me sitting calmly in the corner and made a direct line for my table, knocking a chair out of her way, without a single word of apology to the startled man sitting next to it. "You miserable, thieving ghetto trash!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the exposed brick walls. I slowly locked the screen of my tablet and folded my hands neatly on the tabletop. I looked up at her, my expression utterly blank. The complete lack of fear in my eyes only seemed to enrage her further. "Did you really think you could get away with this?" Chloe screamed, slamming her hands down on the edge of my small wooden table. She leaned in close, her breath coming in ragged, angry gasps. "You think because Marcus finally threw your broke gold-digging self out onto the street that you can just hire some low-life hacker from your old neighborhood to drain our accounts? You hacked my credit cards. You stole my husband's charity funds. You ruined my entire morning. I am going to have you locked up for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life." I maintained my steady gaze, letting her racist assumptions and glaring ignorance fill the quiet room. She was practically vibrating with rage, completely blinded by her own manufactured superiority. She genuinely believed I was a helpless victim lashing out a woman who needed to resort to petty theft to survive without her wealthy, successful brother-in-law. "Your accounts were not hacked, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly controlled. "Your accounts are experiencing a lawful seizure. There is a massive difference. You should probably call David and ask him to explain the concept of federal asset forfeiture, assuming he has stopped crying long enough to speak." The mention of David's panic snapped the last remaining thread of Chloe's fragile self-control. Her face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. She was not used to being challenged, and she certainly was not used to being spoken to with such calm, absolute authority by a black woman she had spent the last 4 years treating like the hired help. "Do not you dare speak to me like we are equals!" Chloe snarled, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "You are nothing. You are a dirty, worthless parasite who leached off my family, and I am going to make sure the police drag you out of here in handcuffs." In her blind rage, Chloe reached out and grabbed a freshly poured, scalding hot latte sitting on the edge of the adjacent table, completely ignoring the shocked customer who had just sat down with it. With a vicious, sweeping motion, she hurled the heavy ceramic mug and its boiling contents directly at my face. She intended to burn me. She intended to leave me scarred and humiliated in the middle of a crowded public space. But Chloe did not realize she had walked into a highly controlled federal environment. Before the ceramic mug even reached the halfway point across the table, the atmosphere in the coffee shop shifted with terrifying, calculated precision. The two tall men in sharp black suits who had been quietly drinking espresso at the table directly behind me moved with explosive speed. They were not random businessmen. They were elite tactical agents from my federal task force, and they had been tailing Chloe since she left the boutique. The first agent lunged forward, his muscular arm sweeping out to intercept the projectile. His forearm smashed into the ceramic mug, deflecting the boiling liquid away from my face. The hot coffee splashed violently across the floor, and the wall missing me entirely, save for a single stray drop that landed lightly on my left cheek. Simultaneously, the second agent closed the distance between himself and Chloe. He moved with cold, mechanical efficiency. He grabbed Chloe by the shoulders, spun her around, and slammed her face first against the exposed brick wall. He kicked her legs apart to break her balance and firmly pinned her arms behind her back. "Get your filthy hands off me!" Chloe shrieked, kicking wildly as her designer purse spilled its contents across the floor. "Do you know who I am? I will have you fired. I will sue you for assault. I will destroy your lives. Let me go." The entire cafe erupted into chaos. Customers jumped out of their seats, knocking over chairs and scrambling away from the commotion. A barista reached for the phone behind the counter, but the first agent immediately raised his hand, flashing a distinct gold badge that caught the morning light. "Federal operation," the agent announced in a booming, authoritative voice that instantly silenced the panicked room. "Everyone remain calm and stay exactly where you are." Chloe froze against the brick wall. Her frantic kicking stopped. The word federal hung over the coffee shop like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She slowly turned her head, her pale eyes wide with sudden, uncomprehending terror, trying to look back at the men restraining her. I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. I slowly wiped the single drop of coffee from my cheek, folding the cloth perfectly before setting it down on the table. I picked up my tablet, stood up, and walked over to where Chloe was pinned against the wall. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as the reality of the situation began to crack through her blinding arrogance. She looked at me, waiting for me to panic, waiting for me to explain why government agents were suddenly involved in a family dispute. I stepped deeply into her personal space. I leaned in close, letting her smell the calm metallic scent of absolute control. I brought my lips right next to her ear. "Assaulting a federal agent carries an automatic 5-year minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary," I whispered, ensuring my voice was low, terrifying, and completely devoid of mercy. "Add that to your wire fraud." Chloe's breath hitched violently in her throat. All the color instantly vanished from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her knees buckled slightly, only the agent's firm grip keeping her from collapsing onto the coffee-stained floor. She was completely and utterly trapped. Less than 20 minutes after Chloe was arrested, Marcus's perfectly curated world began to implode. He stood in his corner office when his cell phone rang. Sterling, his highly paid divorce attorney, was hyperventilating. He kept repeating Department of Justice and Criminal Investigation, babbling about a silver pen left on a conference table. Marcus yelled at Sterling, insisting I must have bought a novelty item to scare them. Before Marcus could finish berating his lawyer, David called, screaming hysterically. Chloe had just been forcefully detained by armed men in dark suits who flashed federal badges before shoving her into an armored SUV. The line went dead. For the first time, Marcus felt genuine fear wrap around his throat. His arrogance cracked. He realized I had not just guessed a charity number or hired a hacker. He assumed I found a federal whistleblower hotline and handed over classified internal documents to extort him before our divorce settlement. Marcus moved with frantic desperation. He sprinted out of his luxury office, entirely ignoring Jessica. He drove recklessly through the city, breaking multiple traffic laws as he sped toward the neglected outskirts of town. Pulling into the pothole-ridden lot of the Starlight Motel, he slammed his car into park and sprinted toward room number 4. Forcing his panic down, he slapped a fake, warm, artificial smile onto his face, channeling the charming persona he used to manipulate investors. He knocked firmly on the peeling wooden door. I opened the door a few seconds later, holding my encrypted tablet in one hand. I looked at Marcus standing under the flickering yellow porch light, his chest heaving, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled from his frantic drive. He looked absolutely pathetic, a cornered animal trying to pretend he was still the apex predator. "Maya," he breathed out, his voice dripping with manufactured relief and fake affection. "Honey, we need to talk. Things have gotten completely out of hand today. I know you are hurt, and I know I said some things yesterday that were unnecessarily harsh, but we are still a family. We do not need to fight like this." I simply leaned against the doorframe, letting his desperate, hollow performance hang in the damp evening air. I did not invite him inside. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I just stared at him with cold, calculating precision. Marcus reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket with trembling fingers. He pulled out a crisp, freshly printed piece of paper. It was a cashier's check. He held it out toward me, the amount clearly visible in bold black ink. $100,000. I managed to secure some emergency liquid funds. Marcus pleaded, his eyes darting nervously around the empty parking lot. Take it, Maya. Take the money. It is more than enough for you to start over anywhere you want. You can buy a nice house, start a new business, travel the world. Just take the check, pack your bags, and leave the state today. Skip the final divorce hearing tomorrow morning. Do not talk to anyone else, do not answer any phone calls, and just walk away from all of this. I will handle the legal paperwork smoothly, I promise. He genuinely believed his own lies. He thought $100,000 was enough to buy the silence of a woman he had spent years treating like an uneducated burden. I looked down at the rectangular piece of paper fluttering slightly in his shaking hand. I did not reach for it. My silence stretched out heavy and suffocating. I am not taking your dirty money, Marcus, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. And I am certainly not running away. The rejection hit him like a physical blow. The fake charming smile vanished instantly, evaporating into the humid night air. The desperate husband act dissolved, replaced by the toxic, vicious narcissist he truly was. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered malice. He took a threatening step forward, looming over me, his voice dropping into a harsh, aggressive snarl. "You stupid, ungrateful woman!" Marcus spat, his eyes burning with intense hatred. "You think you have won something today because you caused a little trouble for Chloe. You think calling a tip line makes you powerful. I am offering you a golden parachute, and you are throwing it in my face. If you do not take this check right now, I will personally ensure you never work in the financial sector again. I will call every accounting firm, every corporate office, and every bank in this country to blacklist you." He leaned in closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, unaware that I was trained to dismantle combatants twice his weight. "You forgot who you are dealing with, Maya," he hissed angrily. "The judge presiding over our case tomorrow is my father's Sunday golfing buddy. I have the best legal team in the state on my payroll. You have absolutely no lawyer. You have no money. You have no connections. You are a penniless black woman standing in a roach-infested motel, and you have absolutely nothing. I will crush you in that courtroom tomorrow, and I will leave you drowning in my fabricated debt." I looked at his flushed, furious face. I slowly reached out and took the cashier's check from his hand. Marcus exhaled sharply, a triumphant smirk returning to his lips, believing I had finally caved to his aggressive intimidation. He thought he had won. I held the heavy paper between my fingers. With deliberate, agonizingly slow precision, I tore the check straight down the middle. Marcus gasped, his eyes widening in shock. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again. I continued tearing the paper until the $100,000 bribe was reduced to a handful of tiny, jagged squares. I opened my hand, letting the paper confetti flutter down like snow, landing directly onto the toes of his custom Italian leather shoes. "See you in federal court, Marcus," I said, my voice ringing out clear and absolute in the quiet night. Marcus looked down at the shredded paper covering his shoes, then back up at me. He let out a loud, harsh bark of condescending laughter. "You are completely delusional," he mocked, shaking his head at my apparent ignorance. "It is family court, you idiot." I just smiled radiantly, stepped back into the dimly lit motel room, and firmly shut the heavy wooden door directly in his furious, arrogant face, locking the deadbolt with a satisfyingly loud metallic click. The heavy metallic click of the motel deadbolt sliding into place was the perfect ending to that miserable night. I slept better on that cheap, sagging mattress than I ever had in Marcus's sprawling suburban mansion. When dawn finally broke, casting a cold gray light across the city, I knew the time for playing the helpless victim was officially over. I stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror and began my transformation. For 4 years, I had deliberately worn faded cardigans, scuffed boots, and discount department store blouses. I had dulled my own shine, making myself look small and entirely unremarkable to fuel Marcus's towering ego. He needed a submissive, broke wife to feel powerful. He needed a blank canvas to project his own delusions of grandeur onto. Today, that canvas was going to burn. I reached into the reinforced garment bag I had retrieved from my secure lockbox the previous evening. I pulled out a razor-sharp custom-tailored charcoal suit crafted from imported Italian wool. I slipped on a pristine silk blouse and stepped into a pair of sleek black stilettos that echoed with absolute authority against the cheap linoleum floor. I pinned my hair back in a tight, flawless style, applying a bold, dark red lipstick that screamed confidence. I did not look like a struggling freelance bookkeeper begging for scraps. I looked like the senior federal agent who was about to dismantle a multi-million-dollar criminal empire. I slid my gold federal badge into my inner pocket, feeling its heavy, comforting weight against my ribs. It was time to go to work. The downtown courthouse was an imposing structure of white marble and soaring glass columns. I arrived exactly 30 minutes before the scheduled hearing. The morning rush was in full swing, with lawyers, clients, and clerks hurrying across the vast, echoing lobby. I walked calmly toward the main security checkpoint, my heels clicking rhythmically, commanding attention from anyone who crossed my path. People instinctively moved out of my way, sensing the kinetic energy radiating from my completely transformed demeanor. I had just placed my designer briefcase onto the security conveyor belt when the heavy revolving glass doors spun open behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who had arrived. The loud, arrogant voices carried across the polished floors instantly. Marcus walked into the courthouse lobby like he owned the entire judicial system. He was surrounded by a massive, bloated entourage designed purely for intimidation. Sterling, his sleazy divorce attorney, flanked his right side, holding a thick leather briefcase. Jessica, the pregnant mistress, clung tightly to Marcus's left arm, wearing a flashy designer dress paid for with stolen funds. Trailing nervously behind them was David, his face still pale and slick with sweat from the financial blackout the day before. Bringing up the rear were Marcus's parents, an older, equally arrogant couple who had spent the last 4 years treating me like an uninvited servant at their lavish holiday dinners. They swept into the security line like a royal procession. Then Marcus spotted me standing alone near the metal detectors. His confident stride faltered for a fraction of a second as his eyes swept over my sharp, expensive suit. I was visibly thrown off balance, unable to reconcile the powerful woman standing in front of him with the broken wife he thought he had left in the freezing rain. But his monumental narcissism quickly recovered. He smirked, nudging Sterling and pointing in my direction. His mother leaned over to Jessica, whispering loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "Look at her dressing up in clothes she probably rented just to impress the judge." His mother scoffed, her voice dripping with the same racist condescension she used when she forced me to eat in the kitchen during their country club Thanksgiving dinner. "You can put a cheap knockoff in a fancy suit, but she is still just a nobody from the wrong side of the tracks." Marcus is finally going to be free of this terrible mistake. Jessica giggled, resting her hand aggressively on her stomach. David stayed perfectly silent, his eyes darting frantically around the lobby, terrified of his own shadow. Sterling stepped forward, eager to perform for his wealthy client. He puffed out his chest, stepping right into my personal space as I retrieved my briefcase from the security scanner. He wanted to humiliate me in front of the dozens of people waiting in line. "Well, well, well," Sterling mocked, his voice booming across the busy lobby. "I must admit, Maya, you certainly dressed up for your own funeral today. But where is your legal representation? Did the free public defender refuse to take your hopeless case? I told you yesterday to sign the papers and walk away clean. Begging in a nice suit will not get you a single dime of alimony today. You have absolutely no leverage, no assets, and no support. You are walking into a slaughterhouse completely blind." Marcus stepped up right next to his lawyer, folding his arms across his chest. "I offered you a golden parachute last night," Marcus sneered, referring to the ripped-up cashier's check. "You chose to be a stubborn, arrogant fool. Now I am going to let the judge strip you of every last cent to your name. You are going to leave this building with nothing but the clothes on your back." The entire entourage laughed in unison, a cruel, harmonious chorus of extreme privilege and toxic delusion. They waited for me to shrink away, to drop my gaze, to show any sign of fear or intimidation. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blazer, keeping my posture impeccably straight. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not defend myself against their pathetic insults. I simply lifted my left arm and looked down at the face of my watch. You are going to regret tearing up that check, Marcus hissed, agitated by my total lack of reaction. Are you even listening to me? I kept my eyes on the sweeping second hand of my watch. I took a slow, deep breath and spoke loud enough for only their group to hear. 3. I counted, my voice ringing with icy authority. What are you babbling about? Sterling scoffed, looking at Marcus in confusion. She has lost her mind. 2. I continued, not breaking my gaze from the watch face. Marcus stepped closer, his face turning red with sudden, inexplicable anger. Stop playing games, Maya. The judge is waiting. 1. I finished, finally looking up to meet Marcus's furious eyes. The heavy steel doors leading to the secure, restricted sector of the courthouse suddenly swung violently open. The chief of courthouse security, a heavily decorated veteran officer, marched directly into the busy lobby. He completely bypassed the regular security lines, ignoring Sterling, ignoring the wealthy parents, and ignoring Marcus entirely. The chief walked straight up to me, stopped abruptly, and snapped his boots together. He stood at perfect attention and delivered a crisp, deeply respectful military salute. Good morning, Special Agent, the chief said, his booming voice echoing off the marble walls, instantly silencing Marcus and his entire entourage. We have been expecting you. Your secure pathway to the courtroom is ready. Follow me, please. The heavy brass clips of the velvet ropes clanked against the stanchions as the chief of security unhooked them, clearing a wide, unobstructed path directly for me. I stepped across the invisible threshold that separated the general public from the inner sanctum of the judicial system. I did not look back. I kept my posture impeccably straight, my heels clicking in perfect rhythm against the polished marble floor, falling right into step behind the chief. We walked past the crowded rows of uncomfortable wooden benches, where ordinary plaintiffs and defendants sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for their names to be called. Instead of directing me to join them, the chief led me toward a set of imposing frosted glass doors, marked Authorized Personnel Only. He swiped a secure keycard, pulling the heavy door open and gesturing for me to step into the private, hushed corridors reserved strictly for judges, senior prosecutors, and high-ranking federal officials. Back in the main lobby, the illusion of Marcus having absolute control was shattering in real time. He instinctively stepped forward, fully expecting to be ushered through the same exclusive pathway. In his arrogant mind, his tailored suit and massive bank accounts granted him universal all-access passes to anywhere he wanted to go. He barely took 2 steps before 2 burly, unsmiling security officers stepped squarely in his path, crossing their muscular arms and forming an impenetrable human wall. Marcus demanded to know why his wife was receiving special treatment, insisting that his high-priced attorney granted him VIP status. The officers did not even blink. They sternly ordered Marcus and his entire entourage to step back behind the velvet ropes and take a seat on the public benches until their docket number was officially called. The public humiliation washed over Marcus like a physical blow. He was forced to turn around and corral his wealthy, status-obsessed parents, his heavily pregnant mistress, and his panicked brother toward a crowded, sticky wooden bench next to a vending machine. Sterling, his aggressive divorce attorney, stood frozen near the metal detectors. His expensive leather briefcase suddenly looked very heavy in his hands. Sterling had spent his entire career bullying unrepresented spouses in state court, leveraging his clients' money to buy favorable outcomes. But what he had just witnessed defied every rule of domestic litigation he knew. A woman he had personally ambushed at a cheap motel less than 48 hours ago was just escorted through a restricted federal corridor by the highest-ranking security official in the building. Sterling tightened his grip on his briefcase, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. Next to Sterling, David was completely falling apart. The older brother clutched his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as a full-blown panic attack seized his lungs. He leaned heavily against the marble wall, his eyes darting frantically between the frosted glass doors where I had disappeared and the exit of the courthouse. The puzzle pieces were violently slamming together in David's mind. The massive charity funds vanishing into thin air. The sudden, localized financial blackout that froze their domestic accounts and credit lines. The terrifying confrontation at the Michelin star restaurant, where I casually recited the exact dollar amount of a highly classified offshore money laundering transfer. And now witnessing me bypass standard security protocols to receive royal treatment from law enforcement. David knew with absolute terrifying certainty that this was not a simple divorce proceeding. This was a targeted, systematic takedown, and they were walking blindly into a slaughterhouse. David grabbed Marcus by the sleeve of his jacket, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wheeze. He begged Marcus to leave the building. He told his brother they needed to run to call their offshore bankers to get to an airport before it was too late. Marcus violently shoved David's hand away, his face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He hissed at his brother to stop acting like a paranoid coward in public. Marcus desperately tried to rationalize what he had just seen, claiming, "I must have slept with a security guard, or called in a pathetic favor to put on a show and intimidate them before the hearing." His narcissism simply would not allow him to accept that a black woman he had spent 4 years degrading could outsmart him, outmaneuver him, and ultimately hold his entire freedom in the palm of her hand. Sitting on the hard wooden bench, Jessica began to whine loudly. She fanned her face with a manicured hand, dramatically complaining about the stale air in the public lobby. She rubbed her pregnant belly and moaned about her designer heels hurting her feet, demanding Marcus go find her a bottle of sparkling water. She whined that the common people staring at them were making her feel nauseous from stress. For the first time in their relationship, Marcus did not coddle his young mistress. The mounting pressure and the inexplicable loss of control caused his temper to snap. He turned on Jessica, his voice dropping into a harsh, vicious snarl, commanding her to shut her mouth and sit quietly. Jessica shrank back in shock, tears welling in her eyes as the charming, generous provider she thought she had secured suddenly revealed his true abusive nature. The tension in their group reached a suffocating boiling point. Marcus paced like a caged animal, his mother fanned herself anxiously, and David looked like he was seconds away from passing out entirely. Sterling stood rigidly beside them, running his thumbs nervously over the brass locks of his briefcase. He could not stop thinking about the silver pen I had left on the conference table. Sterling's hands began to shake visibly as he realized his law license was in jeopardy. The heavy oak doors of the hallway suddenly swung wide open. A stern-faced bailiff stepped out, looked directly at the group, and loudly called their names to proceed finally into courtroom 4B. The doors of courtroom 4B closed with a resounding thud behind Marcus and his entourage, sealing us inside the wood-paneled chamber. I was already seated at the respondent table, relaxed in my tailored charcoal suit, my hands folded neatly. Marcus shoved his way down the center aisle, his face a tight mask of suppressed rage and confusion. He sat at the petitioner table next to Sterling, sharply tugging the cuffs of his expensive jacket. Behind the wooden partition separating the gallery, his family scrambled into the front row. Chloe sat rigidly, arms crossed tight, while David continued to wipe a relentless sheen of cold sweat from his pale forehead. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, clutching her designer purse like a shield. They glared at my back, radiating a toxic mixture of hatred and desperate arrogance. They still believed this was their arena. The side door opened and Judge Harrison walked up to the elevated bench. He was an older, distinguished man known for his zero-tolerance policy regarding courtroom theatrics. The bailiff called the room to order, and the air grew thick with anticipation. Sterling immediately stood up, buttoning his jacket with a theatrical flourish. He requested permission to call his client to the stand. Judge Harrison nodded, gesturing toward the witness box. Marcus stood, smoothed his tie, and walked purposefully toward the front of the room. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. From the very first question Sterling asked, Marcus launched into an Oscar-worthy performance. He slouched his shoulders deliberately, deflating his usually arrogant posture to appear broken and defeated. His voice wavered perfectly on cue, cracking with manufactured emotion as he spun a breathtakingly fabricated narrative of our 4-year marriage. He painted himself as a generous, loving savior who had rescued a struggling, uneducated woman from a life of poverty. He told the court that he had given me everything a woman could possibly desire. Then he described my supposed betrayal. Marcus looked down at his hands, forcing a single fake tear to trace down his cheek. He claimed I was a relentless, greedy parasite who was never satisfied. He testified that my insatiable spending habits and constant emotional volatility had completely drained him. He spun a pathetic story about coming home from exhausting days at work only to be met with my unhinged demands for more money. He told the judge that my toxic behavior had driven him to the brink of a complete mental breakdown, destroying his ability to properly manage his wealth management firm. According to Marcus, I had not only ruined his marriage, but I had single-handedly destroyed his professional empire. I sat perfectly still at my table watching his spectacular display of perjury. I did not object. I did not shake my head. I simply let him weave a web of federal lies on the official court record. "And what are you asking the court to grant you today?" Marcus Sterling asked, his voice dripping with rehearsed sorrow. Marcus looked directly at the judge, his expression hardening into practiced resolve. "I am asking for justice, Your Honor." Marcus pleaded, his voice steadying. "I am asking that Maya be awarded absolutely nothing. She has taken enough from me. She has left me a hollow shell of the man I used to be. I am completely destitute because of her greed. I demand that she walk away from this marriage with zero assets, no alimony, and no claim to my business. It is the only fair outcome for the devastation she has caused my family." A soft collective murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery where his parents and Chloe sat. They were eating up the performance, fully believing that this sob story was going to secure their victory. Sterling returned to his desk and picked up a thick bound document. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the lethal blow he thought would permanently destroy my life. He approached the bench and handed the document up to Judge Harrison. "Your Honor," Sterling announced, his voice booming with arrogant confidence. "My client's testimony regarding his financial ruin is not merely anecdotal. It is backed by certified, irrefutable proof. What I have just handed you is a sworn financial disclosure statement signed and dated just yesterday by the respondent herself. In this document, Maya legally acknowledges and accepts that my client is currently operating with a $5 million deficit. She signed her name, confirming she understands Marcus is completely bankrupt." Sterling turned to look at me, a vicious, triumphant sneer spreading across his slick face. By signing this document, the respondent legally waived any right to demand financial compensation today. She recognized the insolvency of the estate. "In fact, Your Honor, if the respondent attempts to contest this divorce or demand a single penny of alimony, we will formally petition this court to hold her equally liable for half of that $5 million corporate debt. She can either walk away with nothing right now, or she can leave this building $2.5 million in the hole. The choice is hers, but my client is completely protected." Sterling walked back to his table, practically vibrating with pride. Marcus looked down at me from the witness box, his fake tears gone, replaced by a cold, victorious glare. He honestly believed he had checkmated me. He thought the signed deposition was an impenetrable shield that would leave me destitute and completely powerless. He expected the judge to immediately rule in his favor, finalizing the divorce and tossing me out into the street. Judge Harrison picked up the document. He adjusted his glasses, silently reading the cover page. He flipped to the back, examining the signature line where I had used my specialized silver pen just 24 hours ago. The courtroom was dead silent. Chloe leaned forward in the gallery, her phone resting on her knee, desperate to capture the exact moment I was legally destroyed. Judge Harrison slowly lowered the document. He took off his glasses and placed them neatly on his desk. He did not look at the paperwork anymore. He did not look at Sterling, and he certainly did not look at Marcus, who was still sitting eagerly in the witness box, waiting for his ultimate victory. Instead, the judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He brought it down against the sounding block with a sharp, explosive crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent, tense courtroom. The sudden noise made Sterling flinch and David jump in his seat. Judge Harrison stopped Sterling from uttering another single word. The judge shifted his entire posture, leaning forward over the high wooden bench. He turned his attention entirely away from the petitioner's table. He looked directly at me. The annoyance and procedural boredom completely vanished from his face, instantly replaced by an expression of deep, solemn, and undeniable professional respect. Special Agent Maya Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying a heavy, terrifying authority that instantly froze the blood in Marcus's veins. Do you want to present the federal indictment now, or shall we conclude this domestic charade first? Marcus froze completely. The arrogant, triumphant posture he had maintained just seconds ago shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The entire courtroom fell into a suffocating vacuum-sealed silence. The words spoken by Judge Harrison hung heavily in the chilled air, vibrating with a reality Marcus fundamentally refused to accept. He gripped the edge of the polished wooden witness stand so hard his knuckles turned a stark bruised white. His mind violently rejected the information. He looked wildly around the room, expecting someone to laugh, expecting the judge to reveal this was a terrible, highly inappropriate prank. But no one was laughing. Marcus snapped his head toward the bench, his face flushing a dangerous dark crimson. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, spittle flying from his lips as he lost whatever remained of his manufactured composure. Special Agent! Marcus yelled, his voice cracking into a frantic, desperate shriek that echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. Are you completely out of your mind? She is just a broke bookkeeper. She works from a cheap laptop in the guest room. She cannot even afford to pay her own mother's medical bills. You are looking at a desperate lying gold digger who is trying to scam her way out of a legal divorce. The sheer audacity of his outburst sent a shockwave through the gallery. Behind the wooden partition, his family was physically unraveling. David let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp and buried his face in his trembling hands, finally understanding that the federal nightmare he feared was actually sitting right in front of him. Chloe gripped the wooden railing, her knuckles white, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The racist, classist worldview she had used to terrorize me for 4 years was currently being incinerated before her very eyes. Jessica wrapped her arms protectively around her pregnant stomach, her eyes darting toward the heavy courtroom doors, desperately calculating an escape route that no longer existed. At the petitioner table, Sterling looked as though he had been physically struck by lightning. The slick, aggressive divorce attorney shrank back into his heavy leather chair. The memory of the silver pen with the Department of Justice seal suddenly made brutal, horrifying sense. He had not just bullied a helpless woman in a cheap motel. He had formally submitted fabricated financial documents directly to a federal investigator. He had legally implicated himself in a massive federal conspiracy. Judge Harrison did not flinch at Marcus's furious outburst. He looked down from the elevated bench, his expression twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together over the polished mahogany surface. "You do not recognize her, Judge?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping into a deadly, echoing register that commanded absolute authority. "You have been married to a senior undercover agent for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division for 4 years. She is the one who dismantled your entire syndicate." The words struck Marcus with the force of a freight train. He physically stumbled back, his shoulder slamming hard against the wooden railing of the witness box. He stared at me, his eyes wide, manic, and completely unhinged. The reality of his situation began to violently tear through the thick walls of his narcissism. Every memory of our 4-year marriage rapidly played backwards in his mind, painted in a terrifying new light. He remembered the nights. He thought I was dutifully organizing his personal receipts, realizing now I was painstakingly mapping his offshore routing numbers. He remembered the times I quietly served coffee to him and his brother in the home office, realizing I was planting localized audio surveillance. He remembered laughing at my so-called boring client calls, realizing I was checking in with my federal handlers. The woman he thought he had completely controlled, isolated, and discarded was actually a highly trained predator who had been patiently studying his every single move from the inside out. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to threaten me with his powerful connections, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. The arrogant, wealthy corporate giant was instantly reduced to a terrified, cornered criminal. He realized with horrifying clarity that I had not just stumbled upon his Caribbean charity fraud. I had orchestrated the entire financial blackout that wiped his accounts to zero. I was the one who had trapped his naive mistress into signing ownership of his illegal shell companies. I was the architect of his total, inescapable destruction. I sat perfectly still at the respondent table, holding his panicked, desperate gaze. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not give him the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I simply let him drown in the overwhelming weight of his own monumental stupidity. The power dynamic in the room had permanently, irreversibly shifted, and every single person present felt the crushing gravity of that change. Marcus turned to look at me, his chest heaving violently, his pristine suit suddenly looking like a prison uniform. I placed my hands flat on the polished table and pushed myself up. I stood tall, my posture impeccable, commanding the space with an effortless, terrifying authority. The courtroom held its collective breath, watching my every movement carefully. I maintained unyielding eye contact with the man who had thrown my clothes into the freezing rain and mocked my existence. With slow, deliberate precision, I reached up and grasped the single button fastening my tailored charcoal blazer. I unbuttoned the jacket and swept the heavy wool fabric back, hooking my thumb securely into my pocket. Pinned directly to my leather belt, catching the bright fluorescent light of the courtroom, was a heavy gleaming gold federal badge. The metallic shine of the shield confirmed the absolute devastating truth. The silence in the room shattered. Sterling scrambled backward in his chair, his hands shaking so violently he lost his grip entirely. He dropped his heavy leather briefcase. It hit the floor with a massive echoing crash, the brass locks snapping open on impact. Hundreds of pages of fabricated financial disclosures, fraudulent bank statements, and useless divorce settlements exploded outward, scattering wildly across the courtroom floor like a flurry of useless white flags. The trap had officially snapped shut. The metallic crash of Sterling dropping his heavy leather briefcase was the starting gun. Hundreds of pages fluttered through the air, covering the polished mahogany floor in a blanket of useless legal threats. Pure, unadulterated panic erupted immediately at the petitioner table. Sterling fell heavily to his knees, frantically scrambling to gather his fabricated financial disclosures, as if hiding the scattered papers now would somehow erase the federal crime he had just committed in front of a judge. He was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so violently he tore the fraudulent bankruptcy declarations he was desperately trying to save. Marcus could not comprehend the terrifying reality collapsing around him. He lunged forward, slamming both his fists onto his table with a resounding thud. "This is a setup!" Marcus screamed, his voice raw, frantic, and stripped of all its usual corporate polish. "This is an illegal entrapment. You cannot do this. You are my wife. You are supposed to be a low-level bookkeeper." He turned wildly toward Judge Harrison, pointing an accusing, trembling finger directly at the bench. "Your Honor, you have to stop this immediately. She lied on her marriage license. She falsified her entire identity. This whole proceeding is a sham and a violation of my rights." Judge Harrison remained entirely unbothered by Marcus throwing a violent tantrum. The older man leaned back comfortably in his high-backed leather chair, watching the complete implosion with cold professional detachment. "The only sham in this courtroom is the heavily fabricated bankruptcy declaration your lawyer just submitted to a federal agent," the judge stated, his voice cutting through the chaotic noise like a sharpened blade. I highly suggest you remain perfectly still, Marcus. Making aggressive, sudden movements in front of a senior investigator is highly inadvisable for your physical safety." At the table, Jessica buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her makeup ran down her cheeks. The grim reality of signing away her life for Marcus's illegal shell companies was finally crushing her naive delusions of grandeur. Behind the wooden partition, the gallery descended into absolute pandemonium. Marcus's mother was clutching her chest, weeping loudly about her ruined country club reputation and her suddenly disgraced family name. Chloe, however, was scanning the room with the frantic, calculating energy of a cornered rat. Her pale eyes darted away from the disaster unfolding at the defense tables and landed directly on her husband. David had completely checked out. The cowardly older brother, who had happily signed off on millions of dollars in stolen charity funds, was actively abandoning his family. He backed away from his weeping mother. He stepped swiftly away from his furious wife. Keeping his head down, David inched his way up the carpeted center aisle, aiming straight for the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the courtroom. He did not care about Marcus facing 20 years in federal prison. He did not care about Chloe losing her luxury lifestyle and designer handbags. He only cared about saving his own skin from the impending federal indictment. Chloe spotted his cowardly retreat almost immediately. "David, where do you think you are going?" Chloe shrieked, her voice shrill, accusatory, and completely shattering whatever stealth he hoped to maintain. "Do not you dare walk out on me. Do not you dare leave me here to take the fall for your messy, illegal accounting. You promised me those offshore accounts were secure." Marcus whipped his head around at the sound of his sister-in-law screaming. He saw his older brother sprinting for the exit. The ultimate betrayal broke whatever tiny shred of restraint Marcus had left. He vaulted over the wooden swinging gate that separated the trial floor from the public gallery. He lunged into the center aisle, the shoulder seam of his expensive Italian suit tearing open from the violent motion. "David, stop right there!" Marcus roared, sprinting directly after his fleeing brother. "You are not leaving me to face this federal investigation alone. You signed those Caribbean charity disbursements. You are just as guilty as I am." David ignored the screaming entirely. He reached the back of the courtroom, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. He lunged forward for the massive brass handles of the heavy oak doors. He gripped the cold metal with both sweaty hands and yanked backward with all his remaining strength, fully expecting to burst out into the public hallway and disappear into the bustling city streets. As David threw his entire weight against the brass handles, a heavy mechanical sound reverberated clearly through the vast, high-ceilinged chamber. Click. It was a loud, definitive, and terrifying noise. The heavy oak doors did not budge a single inch. David gasped, yanking the handles again, his expensive dress shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished marble floor. Click, click. He slammed his shoulder hard against the thick wood, pushing frantically. The doors remained entirely solid, bolted tight from the other side. The courtroom doors had been electronically locked from the outside. David slowly turned around, his back pressed flat against the locked wooden doors. He looked down the long center aisle at Marcus, who had frozen mid-stride in absolute shock. He looked at Chloe, who had suddenly stopped screaming. He looked at Sterling, who was still kneeling helplessly among his scattered fraudulent documents. They were completely sealed inside. There was absolutely no escape. The wealthy, untouchable family that had spent years operating above the law was now officially caged. I watched their horrific realizations settle over the room. The chaotic noise died down, replaced only by the sound of their ragged, panicked breathing. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit and took a slow, deliberate step away from the respondent table. I stepped out from behind the heavy wooden desk, planting myself firmly in the center of the trial floor. The gold federal badge clipped to my belt caught the harsh overhead lighting, shining like a beacon of absolute authority. I looked directly at my soon-to-be ex-husband, letting him see the total lack of mercy in my eyes. "Sit down, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing loud and clear across the trapped, silent room. "The family court hearing is over. The federal tribunal is now in session." The heavy double doors flanking the judge's bench burst open with a deafening crash. A dozen heavily armed federal agents flooded into the courtroom. They moved with terrifying precision, weapons drawn and expressions hidden behind dark visors. The heavy thud of their combat boots drowned out the frantic whimpers coming from the gallery. 4 agents descended directly upon the petitioner table. They grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, forcefully yanking him out of his leather chair and slamming him face first against the polished wood. Marcus gasped, his cheek pressed hard against the very same fabricated bankruptcy documents he had tried to use to ruin my life just moments earlier. Another team of agents sprinted up the center aisle, intercepting David just as he slid down the locked doors at the back of the room. They hauled the cowardly older brother to his feet, securing his arms behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs. Jessica shrieked, cowering beneath the table until a female agent hauled her up by her designer dress. I walked slowly toward the petitioner table, letting the sheer magnitude of the raid settle over the terrified family. The air was charged with adrenaline and absolute defeat. I looked down at Marcus, whose arms were now wrenched behind his back. I cleared my throat, my voice ringing with clinical, devastating authority. "Marcus Vance," I announced, projecting my voice, so his sobbing parents in the gallery could hear every single syllable. You are hereby under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, international money laundering, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You thought I was spending my evenings organizing your mundane tax receipts. You thought I was just a naive, uneducated woman grateful for the scraps of attention you threw my way. In reality, I was meticulously mapping every single offshore routing number you buried in your encrypted servers. I traced the money you siphoned from domestic investors directly into the Caribbean charity foundations that your brother managed. David let out a loud, pathetic sob from the back of the room, struggling uselessly against the grip of the federal agents. I turned my gaze toward him. You were not running a charity, David, I stated coldly. You were running a highly sophisticated washing machine for illicit syndicates. You took millions of dollars intended for hurricane relief and funneled it through shell companies in the Bahamas. Then you routed that clean cash right back into Marcus's domestic real estate ventures. You were arrogant enough to leave a digital trail a mile wide, assuming no one in your inner circle would ever be smart enough to read a balance sheet. You underestimated me because of the color of my skin and the modest background you constantly mocked. Your racism and blinding entitlement were the greatest assets my investigation ever had. Marcus writhed against the table, his face red and contorted with fury. He tried to lift his head, spitting his words at me. This is illegal, Marcus snarled, his voice breaking under the weight of his collapsing empire. You were my wife. Spousal privilege protects me. You cannot testify against me. Everything you collected is inadmissible in court. You violated my constitutional rights. I smiled, a slow, predatory expression that finally made the blood drain entirely from his face. Spousal privilege only protects confidential communications made in the sanctity of a legitimate marriage. Marriage, I explained smoothly. It does not cover a federal agent conducting an authorized undercover operation involving active financial terrorism. I was deeply embedded, Marcus. Every wiretap, every cloned hard drive, and every seized ledger was signed off by a federal magistrate months before I even walked down the aisle. You invited a federal auditor into your home, gave her the passwords to your life, and then treated her like garbage. You built your own prison cell brick by arrogant brick. Your greed blinded you to the truth right in front of your eyes. The sheer gravity of the charges finally crushed Marcus. His legs gave out and the agents had to physically hold him upright. His arrogance was entirely extinguished, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man facing 20 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary. The gallery behind us was entirely silent now, the wealthy, privileged family utterly paralyzed by the overwhelming display of federal power. I turned my attention away from my former target and looked down at the young woman trembling violently next to him. Jessica was sobbing hysterically, gasping for air, as the federal agents maintained their firm grip on her arms. Just yesterday morning, she had pulled up next to me in a brand new Porsche, gloating about how she had outsmarted me. She had been utterly thrilled to sign her name on dozens of asset transfer documents, believing she was protecting Marcus's massive fortune from a gold-digging ex-wife. She willingly walked into a trap driven entirely by her own toxic hubris and greed. Now the absolute reality of her situation was violently caving in on her. The luxury cars, the penthouse apartments, and the unlimited credit cards she thought she had won were instantly evaporating, replaced by the terrifying prospect of a federal indictment. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a thick, folded legal document bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice. I stepped right up to Jessica. She shrank back, her entire body shaking with uncontrolled terror. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream at her the way she had screamed at me. I simply held out the federal arrest warrant, pressing it firmly against her trembling chest, forcing her to physically take hold of her own destruction. You wanted his assets in your name, Jessica, I whispered, ensuring my voice was low, terrifying, and completely devoid of mercy. Now you have his liabilities too. You are going to federal prison today. Jessica let out a high-pitched wail that shattered the remaining silence in the courtroom. She dropped the heavy federal warrant as if it had physically burned her manicured fingers. Her knees gave out completely, and she collapsed onto the polished mahogany floor in a heap of designer fabric and profound regret. The sound of her hitting the ground acted as a violent catalyst for the man handcuffed just a few feet away. David had been trembling since the federal agent stormed the room, but seeing Jessica handed a direct ticket to a federal penitentiary broke whatever fragile psychological dam he had left. The older brother looked down at his own wrists, the cold steel handcuffs biting sharply into his skin, and the terrifying reality of his situation finally crystallized. David began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he frantically looked around the room. He locked eyes with the lead IRS agent holding his arms. Then his gaze snapped toward the gallery, where his wealthy parents sat paralyzed in horror. The survival instinct of a lifelong coward instantly overrode any lingering sense of familial loyalty. David realized he was holding the bag for a multi-million-dollar international money laundering syndicate, and he was absolutely unwilling to spend the next 2 decades in a concrete cell for a brother who had always treated him like a disposable pawn. "I did not do it!" David screamed, his voice cracking into a desperate guttural shriek that echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. "I did not want to sign those Caribbean charity deeds. Marcus made me do it. He forced me." Marcus jerked his head toward his older brother, his eyes widening in pure, unfiltered shock. "David, shut your mouth right now," Marcus roared, straining violently against the grip of the 2 federal agents pinning him against the defense table. "Do not say another word, you pathetic idiot. You are invoking your right to remain silent." But David was entirely beyond the reach of Marcus's commands. The dam had burst, and the older brother was frantically spilling every toxic secret he had been forced to carry. "He blackmailed me!" David yelled, completely ignoring Marcus and speaking directly to the federal agents, restraining him. "2 years ago, I made some bad investments. I lost my shirt on a commercial real estate deal. Marcus bailed me, but he held the debt over my head. He told me if I did not put my name on the board of directors for the Global Relief Fund, he would foreclose on my house. He said he would tell our parents I was a failure. He controlled all the routing numbers. I just signed where he told me to sign. I am a victim here. He set me up to take the fall." The sheer audacity of David attempting to play the victim while standing in a courtroom financed by stolen hurricane relief funds was staggering. Yet it was the exact action-based backstory I had mapped out during my 4-year investigation. Their family dynamic was built entirely on a foundation of toxic leverage, financial manipulation, and absolute conditional loyalty. Marcus had always wielded his wealth like a weapon, using it to keep his older brother firmly under his boot. Now, that same weapon was being used to sever their bond completely. "You cowardly, spineless piece of garbage!" Marcus bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging as his face flushed a dangerous, violent shade of crimson. "You gladly took your 6-figure salary from those charities. You bought Chloe her luxury cars with that money. You happily lived in the mansion that my syndicate paid for. Do not you dare stand there and pretend you did not know exactly where the cash was coming from." "I was protecting my family," David cried out, tears streaming down his pale, sweating face. "You promised me the feds would never look at a humanitarian fund. You swore it was bulletproof. You ruined my life, Marcus. You ruined all of our lives just so you could feel like a king." The golden boy facade. Marcus had meticulously crafted his entire life, completely disintegrated. The realization that his own flesh and blood was aggressively throwing him under the federal bus in front of a judge, law enforcement, and their parents was the ultimate humiliation. Marcus lost whatever tiny fraction of rational thought he possessed. With a sudden explosive burst of adrenaline-fueled rage, Marcus violently twisted his body, throwing his entire weight backward. He managed to break the grip of the agent on his left side for just a fraction of a second. It was all the time he needed. Marcus lunged across the center aisle, launching himself directly at his older brother. He crashed into David with the force of a battering ram. The 2 brothers slammed hard into the heavy wooden dividers separating the trial floor from the gallery. The impact echoed with a sickening crunch of tearing wood and ripping fabric. David let out a strangled cry as Marcus tackled him to the floor, driving his handcuffed fists into David's chest. "You are a dead man!" Marcus screamed, spitting furiously, as they rolled across the marble tiles. "I gave you everything. I built this family. I will kill you before I let you testify against me." The courtroom erupted into absolute terrifying chaos. The pristine, highly controlled environment devolved into a brutal street brawl. Federal agents swarmed the center aisle, instantly shouting commands as they piled onto the struggling brothers. The sound of scuffling dress shoes, grunts of exertion, and the sharp clatter of metal handcuffs hitting the floor filled the room. Marcus fought like a cornered animal, completely consumed by his narcissistic rage, trying desperately to inflict physical pain on the brother who had just sealed his federal indictment. In the gallery, their parents finally broke out of their paralyzed shock. Their mother leaped to her feet, screaming hysterically, but her cries were incredibly telling. She did not yell for them to stop fighting. She yelled at the federal agents to get their hands off Marcus. Even as David was being crushed under his younger brother's assault, the parents' instinct was to protect their golden child completely, disregarding the safety of their oldest son. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the center of the carnage, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit. I stood perfectly still, my posture commanding, and entirely unbothered, watching the physical manifestation of their moral decay unfold before me. I did not intervene. I did not flinch. I simply let the federal agents do their job as they forcefully wrenched Marcus off of David, slamming the younger brother face down onto the cold marble floor to finally subdue him. This was the ultimate payoff I had worked 4 grueling years to achieve. I watched coldly as the brothers turned on each other with vicious primal hatred. The wealthy, picture-perfect family that had stood unified on a rainy porch just days ago to mock a black woman they deemed inferior was now reduced to a bloody, sobbing brawl on a courtroom floor. Their wealth could not save them. Their arrogance could not shield them. They had absolutely zero loyalty to anyone but themselves, and I stood victorious watching their toxic empire consume itself from the inside out. I stood perfectly victorious, silently watching their highly toxic empire finally consume itself completely from the inside out. Agents had subdued the physical altercation, leaving Marcus and David pinned against the polished marble floor. The agents secured the two brothers. The chaotic spectacle was not entirely over. Up in the public gallery, the reality of the situation was finally penetrating the thick, delusional skull of my sister-in-law. Chloe had watched her lavish lifestyle evaporate into thin air. And instead of remaining quiet, instead of contacting a defense attorney, Chloe chose to double down on the only weapon she had ever known: her blinding, weaponized privilege. Chloe bolted upright from her bench, pointing a manicured finger at the lead IRS agent securing David. "Get your hands off my husband," Chloe shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "Do you have any idea who we are? You cannot just storm into a courtroom and assault wealthy people. I will have every single one of you fired by the end of the day." The federal agents ignored her completely. This pushed Chloe over the edge. She furiously pushed past her deeply weeping mother-in-law and slammed her hands down incredibly hard on the wooden railing separating the gallery from the main trial floor. "Listen to me," Chloe screamed. Her face flushed a blotchy, deep red as she glared down at the remaining agents on the floor. "This is a massive misunderstanding. We are completely innocent victims of a cyber attack. Someone hacked our bank accounts yesterday morning. You are targeting the wrong people. I am going to sue the Department of Justice for emotional distress." Her shrill threats bounced off the ceiling. She was desperately clinging to the delusion that her privilege made her immune to federal prosecution. For 4 years, I had listened to Chloe make racist remarks about my perceived lack of wealth while she paraded around in clothes paid for by stolen relief funds. Now the gag order was lifted. I slowly walked toward the wooden gallery railing where Chloe was throwing her temper tantrum. Chloe stopped screaming as I approached. She looked down at me from the gallery, her pale eyes wide with a frantic, desperate mixture of hatred and terror. She tried to maintain her posture of inherent superiority, gripping the wooden railing so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark white. "Tell your people to release my husband," Maya, Chloe demanded. "Now call off your attack dogs before I press charges against you for hacking my bank accounts." I stopped just a few inches away from the wooden partition standing directly in front of her. I looked up at her flushed, panicked face. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that commanded absolute silence from everyone in the immediate vicinity. Your accounts were not hacked, Chloe, I stated, enunciating every single syllable with crystal clear pronunciation. There is no mysterious hacker from my old neighborhood. There is no cyber attack. Chloe stared at me, her mouth slightly open, her breath catching in her throat. I personally drafted the asset seizure warrants for your entire estate, I continued smoothly, letting the devastating reality of my words sink into her brain. I sat at my desk and I typed out the legal justification to freeze the domestic trust fund you used to pay your country club fees. I authorized the immediate confiscation of your sprawling suburban mansion. I signed the paperwork to seize your customized luxury vehicles. I even cataloged and ordered the confiscation of your entire collection of imported designer bags because every single item you own was purchased with illicit funds generated by a criminal syndicate. Chloe physically staggered backward as if I had struck her across the face. The aggressive, entitled posture completely collapsed. She looked frantically down at her hands, at the expensive diamond rings she was wearing, suddenly realizing that even the jewelry on her fingers was currently classified as federal evidence. The fantasy world she had constructed, a world where she reigned supreme over everyone she deemed inferior, was being violently dismantled. You do not have a cent to your name, I told her, my voice echoing in the quiet space between us. The credit cards you tried to use at the boutique yesterday are permanently dead. Your husband is facing decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and conspiracy. The life you thought you were entitled to is officially over. You are now entirely bankrupt. The sheer, crushing weight of the truth finally broke her. Chloe let out a devastating, ragged sob that tore through the silent courtroom. Her legs gave out completely beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard floor of the gallery, falling heavily to her knees. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, weeping uncontrollably, the pristine image of wealthy perfection completely shattered. She sobbed for her lost money, for her confiscated cars, and for the public humiliation that would soon make her a social outcast in her elite suburban circles. I stood perfectly upright, watching the woman who had tormented me for years weeping on the floor at my feet. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the deep, satisfying closure of executing perfect legal justice. I leaned forward over the heavy wooden railing, looking down at Chloe's shaking, defeated form. She looked up at me through a blurry haze of tears, her mascara running down her flushed cheeks. You were right about one thing yesterday morning, I whispered, making sure my voice carried directly to her ears and nowhere else. You told me that my future involved counting food stamps. Chloe let out another pathetic sob, burying her face in her hands. I kept my gaze fixed coldly on her, watching her entire world collapse into absolute nothingness. Counting food stamps is going to be a very real part of your future, Chloe, I said, dropping the ultimate truth onto her shattered ego. Enjoy your brand new lifestyle. I turned my back on the sobbing mess in the gallery. Chloe was no longer my concern. She was a civilian casualty of her own blinding arrogance. My heavy heels clicked against the polished mahogany floor as I descended the short set of steps back to the main trial area. The federal agents had hauled Marcus up from the ground. His expensive Italian suit, the one he had worn to project absolute superiority, was torn at the shoulder and smeared with dust from his brawl with David. His hands were securely fastened behind his back in heavy steel cuffs. The smug, untouchable wealth manager, who had thrown my clothes into the freezing rain, was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, desperate man, staring down the barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence. As I approached him, the remaining fight drained out of Marcus's body. His shoulders slumped and his chest heaved with erratic, panicked breaths. He looked at my tailored suit, the gold badge shining on my belt, and finally understood that intimidation would never work again. So he immediately pivoted to his only remaining tactic, emotional manipulation. Maya, please, Marcus begged, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. He looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, trying to summon the charming facade he had used to deceive his investors for a decade. You have to stop this. I know I made mistakes. I know I was cruel yesterday, but you cannot destroy my entire life over a bad divorce. We spent 4 years together. We shared a home. We shared a life. I loved you, Maya. You have to know that somewhere deep down I actually loved you. Please, do not do this to the man you promised to spend your life with. The sheer audacity of his plea was almost physically revolting. He was standing in a courtroom financed by stolen charity funds, mere feet away from the pregnant assistant he had used as a human shield, attempting to leverage a marriage built entirely on deception. I stopped 2 feet in front of him, keeping my expression entirely flat. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of sympathy. You did not love me, Marcus, I stated, my voice ringing with icy clarity. You loved the power you thought you held over me. You loved having a black woman you could degrade behind closed doors to inflate your own pathetic ego. You loved having a quiet, compliant accessory who made your fake progressive corporate image look good for the board of directors. You never loved me because you never actually knew me. The woman you married never existed. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, to spin another lie, but I did not give him the oxygen. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and pulled out a neatly folded stack of legal papers. I shook them open, holding the document right in front of his face. It was the fraudulent financial disclosure he had forced me to sign in his downtown conference room just 24 hours ago. Do you recognize this, Marcus? I asked, my tone shifting from personal disgust to clinical federal authority. Marcus blinked, struggling to focus on the pages. He saw his own company letterhead. He saw the fabricated balance sheets showing a catastrophic $5 million deficit. And he saw my signature at the very bottom, signed with the Silver Department of Justice pen. He nodded slowly, clearly confused about why I was bringing up his fake bankruptcy filing while he was currently facing international money laundering charges. You thought you were a genius yesterday, I continued, my voice smooth and lethal. You and Sterling drafted this fraudulent document to prove to the family court that you were completely destitute. You demanded that I sign it legally, acknowledging that you had absolutely zero assets, zero offshore accounts, and zero hidden wealth. You wanted to guarantee that I walked away from this divorce without a single penny to my name. Marcus swallowed hard, looking over his shoulder at Sterling, who was still kneeling on the floor, looking physically sick. Yes, Marcus whispered frantically. It was just a divorce strategy, Maya. It was just an aggressive tactic to protect my money from the settlement. It does not matter now. Please just tell them to let me go. It matters more than you could possibly comprehend. I corrected him, stepping even closer so he could not look away. By forcing a federal agent to witness and sign this document, you formally submitted a declaration of bankruptcy to the United States government. You legally swore under penalty of perjury that you do not own a single dollar of the $40 million currently sitting in those Cayman Island trusts. You legally disavowed ownership of every single offshore shell company, every hidden real estate deed, and every black market investment portfolio. The realization began to slowly creep into Marcus's eyes, a dawning horror that paralyzed his vocal cords. He stopped breathing. When the federal government seizes illicit funds, I explained, watching the color drain completely from his face, the target usually ties the funds up in years of appellate litigation, claiming the money was legally earned. They use their hidden wealth to hire expensive defense attorneys to fight the seizure. But you cannot do that, Marcus. You cannot hire a defense attorney to fight for your offshore money because you just officially declared to a judge that the money does not belong to you. I stepped back, letting the trap fully close around him. By trying to leave me penniless, you legally surrendered all claim to any hidden assets the feds seize today. The government is taking every single dime, and you have absolutely zero legal standing to fight the seizure. The devastating brilliance of the trap finally crashed down on Marcus, with the full weight of a collapsing skyscraper. The very weapon he had maliciously crafted to leave a black woman destitute on the street was the exact legal instrument that permanently stripped him of his entire fortune. He had handed the federal government the keys to his empire on a silver platter, all because his racism and blinding arrogance demanded that he humiliate me on the official record. I was not just going to federal prison. He was going to emerge in 20 years as a completely broke, debt-ridden felon with no secret safety net waiting for him. No, Marcus gasped, his knees buckling slightly against the firm grip of the federal agents. No, that is not fair. You tricked me. You set me up. That is my money. I earned that money. I did not set you up. Marcus, I replied coldly. folding the document back up and sliding it into my pocket. I just let you dig your own grave and then I handed you the shovel. The final shred of Marcus's sanity snapped. The reality of his absolute irreversible destruction shattered his mind. He collapsed heavily against the federal agents holding him, his head falling forward onto his chest. A low, pathetic wail escaped his throat. Tears streamed down his face, dripping onto the polished marble floor. He wailed for his lost mansions, his confiscated sports cars, and the absolute destruction of his elite status. The ruthless, touchable corporate titan began to weep uncontrollably, his loud heaving sobs echoing miserably across the courtroom floor as he realized his own malicious divorce trap was exactly what had stripped him of his very last remaining offshore safety net. The loud heaving sobs echoing across the courtroom floor did not belong to a powerful wealth manager. They belonged to a broken, defeated man who had just handed the federal government the keys to his own destruction. Marcus wept with pathetic, agonizing intensity. Behind the splintered wooden partition of the gallery, a different kind of breakdown was taking place. The heavy, polished facade of Marcus's parents completely dissolved. These were the exact same people who had stood on their immaculate front porch, laughing while my clothes were thrown into the freezing rain. They had spent 4 years treating me like an uninvited servant. Now their pristine country club existence was burning to ash right before their horrified eyes. Marcus's mother pushed herself up from the hard wooden bench, her designer silk blouse wrinkled and heavily stained with her own panicked tears. She reached her shaking hands out toward me, her knuckles turning white with absolute desperation. "Maya, please," she wailed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You have to stop this right now. You cannot let these people take my boys away. They are good men. They are successful, respectable men. Please just tell these agents to let them go. We can handle whatever financial mistake happened here privately like a real family." Her husband scrambled to the wooden railing right next to her. The patriarch of the family, a man who had built his entire identity on sneering at anyone who earned a living through physical labor, looked entirely haggard and incredibly small. His face was a pale, sickly gray. "We will make this right," his father pleaded, his voice trembling with frantic urgency. "We will compensate you, Maya. Whatever you want. We will set up a massive trust in your name. We will give you the summer house in the Hamptons. Just call off this federal investigation. You are family. You cannot send your own family to a federal prison." I stood perfectly still in the center of the trial floor, my hands resting easily at my sides. The utter delusion of their bargaining was staggering. Even now, they genuinely believed their money could buy them out of accountability. They honestly thought they could simply write a check to brush a massive international money laundering syndicate right under the rug. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The entire courtroom was so deadly quiet that my even, measured tone carried easily to the frantic couple clinging desperately to the wooden partition. "We are not family," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "We never were. Family does not sit at a Thanksgiving table and joke about how a black daughter-in-law should be grateful she was allowed to eat in the main dining room. Family does not stand by and smile while a husband systematically abuses his wife and tries to leave her homeless in a violent rainstorm. You never saw me as a human being. You saw me as a convenient prop and a punching bag for your unchecked bigotry." Marcus's mother let out a loud gasp, burying her face in her hands as her tears flowed freely over her diamond rings. She shook her head violently, trying to reject the ugly, undeniable truth I was forcing her to confront. "You groomed your sons to believe they were completely untouchable." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the gallery. "You taught them that immense wealth excused extreme cruelty. You taught them that people who work hard for a modest paycheck are inferior and exist only to be ruthlessly exploited. You cheered when Marcus bullied his employees, and you looked the other way when David bought his mansions with money that did not belong to him. You did not raise successful businessmen. You raised thieves who looked down on honest work." The father opened his mouth to argue, to offer another useless bribe, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The crushing gravity of my words pinned him silently against the railing. "Your golden boys built a criminal empire on the backs of stolen charity funds," I said, delivering the final lethal blow to their arrogant dynasty. "And now the empire is entirely gone. The domestic assets are now completely seized. The mansions will be auctioned off by the federal government. You have absolutely nothing left to bargain with. Your legacy ends today, and it ends in a federal penitentiary. I held their horrified, tear-streaked gaze for one long, silent second. Then, with smooth, terrifying precision, I turned my back on them completely. I dismissed their entire existence with a single sharp pivot of my heels. Marcus's mother let out a devastating scream, collapsing heavily against her husband as her knees finally gave out. Her hysterical cries for her sons filled the high vaulted ceiling, mingling with the sharp metallic clatter of handcuffs and the heavy thud of tactical boots. "Get them out of here," the lead agent commanded, gesturing sharply toward the main exit. The federal agents moved with swift, synchronized efficiency. They hauled Marcus and David toward the heavy oak doors. Marcus dragged his feet, his head hanging in total defeat, while David continued to weep uncontrollably, his cowardly spirit completely broken by the reality of his impending sentence. The agents shoved them forcefully through the exit, their tailored suits disappearing into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the public hallway. Jessica was escorted out right behind them, her head bowed in absolute shame. The heavy courtroom doors swung shut with a loud, definitive slam, sealing the fate of the toxic family that had tried to destroy me. The frantic noise of the arrests faded away, leaving the trial floor beautifully, perfectly quiet. I stood entirely alone in the center of the vast mahogany room. The gold badge on my belt caught the warm light filtering through the high windows. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I was victorious, completely unbothered and free. I turned my back on the massive mahogany bench and began my final walk down the center aisle. The heavy double doors of courtroom 4B yielded easily to my push. Stepping out into the cavernous public hallway, the chaotic energy of the morning had completely dissipated. The frantic echoes of Marcus screaming and Chloe sobbing were muffled behind the thick, soundproofed walls, reduced to nothing more than a pathetic murmur. I walked past the empty wooden benches where my former in-laws had sat just an hour ago, completely confident in their manufactured superiority. They had brought their arrogance into a federal building, fully expecting to watch my destruction as a spectator sport. Instead, they became the main event of their own spectacular downfall. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Every step I took away from that courtroom felt like shedding a physical weight. For 4 grueling years, I had carried the burden of their toxic entitlement. I had swallowed my pride, biting my tongue, while Chloe hurled racist insults about my natural hair and my supposed lack of education. I had smiled politely, while Marcus paraded his wealth using his laundered money to make me feel small and dependent. I had played the role of the submissive, invisible black wife because the mission demanded absolute discipline. But the mission was over. The target was neutralized. The syndicate was dismantled. I was no longer Maya the broke bookkeeper. I was a senior federal agent who had just executed one of the most successful financial takedowns in the history of the department. I approached the main security checkpoint. The same guards who had watched Sterling mock me earlier this morning now stood tall, offering crisp nods of profound respect as I bypassed the metal detectors. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the courthouse lobby and stepped out onto the wide concrete plaza. The crisp, biting air of the city hit my face, instantly clearing away the stifling, stale atmosphere of the courtroom. The storm from the previous night had completely passed, leaving the sky a brilliant, blinding shade of clear blue. The bright sunlight reflected off the wet pavement, washing the city in a fresh, clean glow. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs with the cold air. It tasted like absolute victory. I stopped at the edge of the plaza, standing near a busy crosswalk. The city was moving around me, ordinary people hurrying to their jobs, completely unaware of the massive criminal empire that had just been eradicated inside the building behind me. I looked down at my left hand. Resting on my ring finger was the massive, gaudy diamond engagement ring Marcus had purchased 4 years ago. He had picked it out himself, totally ignoring my preferences, choosing a flashy, ostentatious stone simply because he wanted a visible monument to his own wealth. He used to grab my hand at dinner parties, showing off the ring to his wealthy investors, treating me like a decorated piece of property. The ring was never a symbol of love. It was a tracking device. It was a shackle designed to bind me to a man who possessed no moral compass, no loyalty, and no soul. It was the final remaining physical tie to my undercover assignment. I reached over with my right hand and gripped the cold metal band. With a smooth, effortless motion, I slid the heavy diamond off my finger. It left a faint, pale indentation on my skin, a temporary ghost of a fake marriage that would soon fade away completely. I held the ring up, watching the sunlight catch the multifaceted diamond. It was worth more than most people made in a year, purchased entirely with stolen charity funds meant for disaster relief. It was blood money perfectly disguised as romance. I lowered my hand and turned toward a rusted municipal trash can sitting on the corner of the sidewalk. I did not pause to admire the stone. I did not feel a single ounce of sentimentality or regret. I simply opened my fingers and let the ring drop. The heavy platinum band hit the bottom of the trash bin with a dull, hollow clatter, landing perfectly among discarded coffee cups and crumpled fast food wrappers. It was exactly where Marcus and his entire legacy belonged. I rubbed my bare finger, feeling the blood circulate freely again. I did not give the trash can a second glance. I turned my attention back to the busy street just as a massive armored black SUV smoothly pulled out of the city traffic. The heavy vehicle glided silently toward the curb, stopping precisely in front of me. The dark, heavily tinted passenger window rolled down with a quiet electronic hum. Sitting in the driver's seat was my tactical commander. He was a seasoned veteran of the agency, a man who had guided my operation from the very beginning, ensuring every wiretap and every subpoena was flawlessly executed. He looked at me, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his usually stern face. "Excellent work, Agent," the commander said, his voice carrying the deep, rewarding resonance of a hard-fought victory. "The asset seizure teams have officially secured all target locations. The Cayman accounts are fully locked. You executed a perfect operation. Ready for the next target." I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal blazer and pulled out my dark aviator sunglasses. I slid them onto my face, the dark lenses shielding my eyes from the bright morning sun, instantly completing my transition back into my true identity. I adjusted the lapels of my suit, standing tall on the edge of the curb. I felt a surge of pure, unstoppable adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Always," I replied, my voice steady, confident, and completely ready for the fight. "Let us go take out the trash." I opened the heavy armored door of the SUV and climbed into the passenger seat. The door slammed shut with a solid protective thud, sealing me inside the secure vehicle. The commander shifted the car into drive and the powerful engine roared to life. We pulled away from the curb, seamlessly merging into the fast-flowing city traffic. I looked out the tinted window one last time, watching the imposing white marble columns of the courthouse rapidly shrink in the side mirror. Inside that building, Marcus, Chloe, David, and Jessica were currently being processed, fingerprinted, and stripped of everything they thought made them superior. Their toxic, racist, arrogant family dynasty was officially reduced to nothing but federal evidence. I faced forward, looking straight down the open road ahead of me, driving off to my new life, leaving the absolute ruins of my fake family behind, forever. The story of Maya dismantles the dangerous illusion that wealth and privilege offer permanent immunity from accountability. At its core, this narrative teaches a profound lesson about the devastating consequences of toxic arrogance, deeply rooted prejudice, and blinding entitlement. When people build their entire existence on a fragile foundation of cruelty, fraud, and the systemic belittlement of others, they inadvertently construct the very cages that will eventually imprison them. Marcus, Chloe, and their complicit family members fundamentally underestimated Maya because their extreme narcissism and racial biases blinded them to her brilliance. They viewed her quiet compliance as weakness and her modest background as a vulnerability to be exploited. However, her journey illustrates that true, unshakable power never needs to scream for attention. It operates in absolute silence. Real strength lies in strategic preparation, emotional discipline, and the quiet accumulation of undeniable truth. Instead of reacting to their daily provocations or fighting petty battles to prove her worth, Maya utilized their own malicious actions as the very evidence needed to secure their ultimate destruction. The toxic downfall was not merely a product of bad luck, it was a direct, inescapable consequence of their own arrogant choices. They essentially handed the federal government the keys to their illicit empire out of pure greed and spite. Ultimately, this narrative serves as a powerful reminder that you should never let toxic individuals define your worth or dictate your future. Silence is not surrender, it is a tactical advantage. When you know your own value, you never have to beg for respect from those who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. Have you ever had to quietly prepare your own comeback while dealing with a toxic environment? Share your personal experiences in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe for more engaging